All right, hello everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the third episode of the Dharma Warrior podcast. I am here again today with my good friend, Mr. Harry, Neal, John MacRae of Iron Age Jyotish, and today we're here for the second installment of our Mysteries of Jyotish series, which will be on the 12 Rashis, which are spirits associated with the 12 signs of the Zodiac, as we would call them in the West, I guess you could say. So I'm happy to have you all here today, and all things should be ready to go here. I have my two dogs, Odin and Shiva, at my sides here, so they hopefully will stay out of our hair and keep resting, and I guess we can get started. I wore all of my lapis for Mr. Neal John today. And we both had kind of a big week for some different reasons. Yeah, we'll have to remember in a future episode to talk about my moon in Mrigashira transition that happened this week, because it felt pretty intense for me. I have Mars in the first house, and Mars rules Mrigashira, and I just sort of had a really high intensity couple of days, and I, as usual, reached out to Mr. Neal to see what was going on in the stars that could explain this, and as usual, he had a very accurate explanation. Which was that the moon was transitioning into Mrigashira, which was where the moon was placed when I was born, and that seemed to have a particularly auspicious sort of, or was a sign of a particularly auspicious something happening on the other side of the veil, we'll say, but we'll discuss that in a future episode, I believe. I particularly want to one day have Mr. Neal John come on the podcast and take my birth chart for all of your amusement, and take all of my particular placements and have Mr. Neal John just explain it out, because he knows me very well and he can get into just very specific things. He seems to think that this is a bad idea, that I shouldn't really offer over this information to the general public, but I would invite any of you to use this information against me. I'm not overly concerned about that, but anyway, yeah, so we have some plans for another couple of episodes in the future. I hope you all tuned into those, but for now, we're going to be talking about the Mysteries of Jyotish, the Rashis, and I will let Mr. Neal John take it away from there. So how are you doing today, Mr. Neal John?
I'm doing very well. As always, happy to be on the show, and as always, I'm happy to talk about Jyotish with anybody, and dump an absurd amount of time and energy into doing so. So basically, the Rashis are the zodiacal signs that everyone's familiar with. Like, we've all heard of Aries and Leo and Sagittarius and Capricorn, all that stuff. Like, that's not something that's foreign to the Westerner in terms of it being like a part of his lexicon, right? Now, maybe a smaller portion of the population actually has any kind of like depth knowledge within the Western astrological tradition about any of those signs, but basically people know what those are. They've heard those names. It's kind of sitting around somewhere in the back of your mind, whether you believe in it or not. And in that sense, there is this common ground between the Western and the Eastern traditions of astrology, in that Jyotish does use the 12 zodiacal signs. And the only difference being is that they don't only use those 12 signs. As I've mentioned in the past, we also use the 27 lunar mansions, or nakshatras. And they are basically just signs that take up a much smaller amount of space. If you're dividing at 360-degree zodiacal ellipses or elliptic, and then we're just taking that and we're saying, we're going to divide that up into 13-degree portions, roughly 13 degrees. It's actually 13 degrees in so many minutes.
Wait, 1 second. I was just going to say that perhaps at this point, if anyone hasn't watched the first installment of the Mysteries of Jyotish series, the Dharma Warrior podcast, episode 2, you can find that, and it's our first installment, the Mysteries of Jyotish, the planets, and you should really get into that before you start getting into the zodiacal signs and nakshatras and everything, because you'll probably, not that you would get lost, but that you wouldn't have the foundational understanding of the planetary forces that rule over different signs and houses and things like that. But I just thought I should say that, because I should have introduced by saying that saying to go back and watch the first installment on the planets if you haven't done so yet. Pardon my interruption there, but carry on.
Oh, no, it's okay. That's actually very salient, because if you don't understand the planets, the signs actually don't really tell you a whole lot on their own, because they derive their nature from their ruling planet. And they are a specification, or like an extension into specificity in the basically in the general semantic realm of a planet's meaning and sort of mythology. So when we talk about a particular sign, we're saying this is essentially one particular facet of this planet's function, and what it does and what it is. But these 12 signs, they're common in both systems. The only major difference, as has been discussed in the last podcast, is that the way that we determine what the signs are for a given native, a given person who's being charted, is in the West, there are fixed degrees, and they do not actually figure the precession of the equinoxes into their calculations. And in the East, we do. We use an Ayanamsha, which is a series of very complex calculations, which are often now done with a calculator. Used to have to be done by hand. That will tell us where precisely the stars are in relation to Earth and the other planets right now, right? So
rather than in the year 150 CE approximately, which Western astrology has been pretending is where the sky is since that time.
Yeah,
roughly.
It's just been stuck in time. Which is one of the major reasons why it's not a very good system and doesn't really describe things very well. One of the many reasons that that's the case, but that's probably the most glaring. So we have these 12 signs. Now, the reason why Jyotish has these 12 signs and not just the lunar mansions is because of contact with the Greco-Roman world prior to the fixation of the zodiac, or at least around that time. So there were still Western astrologers that were using what we would call in the East an Ayanamsha, and then this was preserved. So
can you remind me of the name of the text that came out around that time that was a synthesis of Jyotish and the Greek version of astrology? Or there is a...
Yeah, so there's actually... Yes, so there's a few texts. 1 second, I'm trying to remember the exact way to pronounce it. Not bothering. 1 moment here.
I had it written down in my notes from the
it's first
episode because you told me about it and it sparked
the Ivana, the Ivana Jataka. So, which basically just means the sayings of the Greeks. It's essentially, it's a text that basically explains how the two traditions converge, and it was an attempt by Eastern astrologers to assimilate the Greek system, not simply take it on, but actually combine it with and hybridize it with their native lunar system. So the two things actually were combined together to create what we now call Jyotish, and as it is now practiced. So that means that the 12 sign system is sort of an additional point of orientation within Jyotish. And so the 12 signs, for those who don't know, are Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. All 12 of these also correspond to the houses in the birth chart. So your first house will have the qualities of Aries, second house qualities of Taurus, so on and so forth. So the number in the sequence, Aries is number 1, Pisces is 12, is actually the same in terms of like determining like the essence of the houses with the same number in the series, right? So we're talking about the fourth house, we're talking about Cancer, all that. So we'll get into that later on. But the signs themselves are essentially, unlike the nakshatras, they're not as specific. They're more like these sort of narrative chapters. And if we actually look at the zodiac as a story, or the story rather, the sort of overarching narrative of time itself, right, on multiple scales. So that could be like the story of a day, of a year, of a lifetime, of an age, of the universe, right, or universes. So you can always expand it, right, to sort of take it on as this sort of description of time. So, or you can narrow it down to a moment, right? And we actually do that in astrology. There's all these divisional charts that you can use to actually get into very specific like moments. You can actually like break down one house into an entire chart. So there's all kinds of like really, really like fine degrees of gradation you can get into. But if we're talking about the Rashis themselves, or we're essentially describing chapter-like sequences in this story. And so we can use them to describe history and the sort of general course of events in our lives, human civilization, everything. So Aries, therefore, as the first sign, is the sign of creation. And this is sort of cosmogenesis. That's basically what Aries is about, is the actual explosive moment of cosmogenesis. So in the scientific materialist paradigm, this is the Big Bang. In the biblical Abrahamic tradition, you have the 7 days of creation. This all would take place within Aries, 7 days of creation. And it's very much the same thing for every tradition, actually. They all have a moment of cosmogenesis. There is some sort of primordial state which is violated by, or not violated, but like is radically transformed or brought from a potential to an actual state, right? So manifestation begins.
Well, sorry, we were just discussing something similar to that yesterday when we were talking about the creation myth of the local Nova Scotian Mi'kmaq people, and that in the beginning there were 7 sparks that came out of the fire of creation, and then the 8th spark created Glooscap, who is sort of this air-like spirit who's an intermediary between this world and that world. But anyway, the number 7 and creation. The number 7, particularly in cultures across the world, has been sacred. And one sort of layer to that numerological sort of aspect, I'm just trying to say that one aspect of the number 7 being considered sacred is obviously the observation of the 7 luminaries in the sky that move freely, unlike the fixed stars.
You have 7 planets, and that we actually only use in Jyotish the 7 classical planets for the rulerships of the Rashis, the zodiacal signs, because this is actually extremely important. Before we go any further, I really want to lay that down right now. Is that the outer planets, which were all discovered basically in early modernity, or more, or even really recently, within the last little over 100 years, like Pluto was only discovered in the 1900s, right?
Right.
So
Saturn is the last or the furthest object away from Earth that we can see with our naked eye.
Yes. Yeah, and that's why it's the outmost, right? And so once you go beyond that, you can actually no longer see the planet with the naked eye or telescope or anything. It's actually becomes very difficult. You need like really intense magnification to find the outer planets, despite even in some cases their great size. And so essentially what we're dealing with here is that people will say that, oh, well, Jyotish hasn't moved ahead with the times and they're not using these planets. And that's not entirely accurate. There are Jyotishis who do it. I don't, mainly because I think that if these planets do have significance in that way, it's not very well understood. And there's not a lot for us to go on mythologically. And it's a kind of like a difficult thing to do, because I mean, these planets were not named or incorporated into systems of thought that were in any way rooted in a spiritual tradition. So a
that
lot
makes
of
total
these
sense to me with my understanding of the outer planets, and people have made attempts to synthesize different systems, such as the Tree of Life of Kabbalah, and to place those planets on the Tree of Life, like all of the 7 traditional sacred planets. And it's been argued the validity of those associations and things like that. I think that there are sort of that in certain cases that people are getting at something sort of meaningful there by placing Pluto on the highest or furthest out sphere of the Tree of Life, and being Kether the crown. But then you have Neptune often associated to the second sphere of Chokmah, which is traditionally associated to the Zodiac, or any of the other stars and bodies in the sky that are beyond Saturn, basically. So there's of the 7 lower planets and where they appear on the Tree of Life. All of them are below the abyss, except for Saturn. Saturn is the womb of time, or the womb of the goddess. And then opposite to it is a sort of god force, which is traditionally in Kabbalah associated to the Zodiac. But in more modern Kabbalists and such will attribute that sphere to Neptune. And so you'll see the symbol of Neptune opposite to Saturn, representing a sort of this dichotomy that exists, that a pagan would, I guess, call the god and goddess energy, and then the higher sphere of Kether the crown is sort of what Wiccan would call the two that move as one, or what you could call just the ultimate reality, or the godlike energy that exists beyond any sort of ideas of masculine and feminine duality. But anyway, yeah, there's all sorts of ways that people try to incorporate those new planets, and it is wishy-washy ultimately when it boils down to it, because as you were saying, we don't have any of that ancient mythological backup and all of these stories and myths to accompany it, like we do with the 7 ancient planets, where they appear in the stories and myths of people all around the world.
Well, that's the thing too, is that the names that were given to these planets are brought from mythology. Like, there is a Pluto, there is a Uranus, there is a Neptune in the Western tradition. But the fact that the people who attributed the names to these planets were not in any way genuinely rooted in that tradition, and in any way other than just remembering that it had existed. You know what I mean?
So we discover so when we discover the planetary body that we now call Pluto, suddenly you have this link that doesn't necessarily exist between this thing moving around in the sky very far out in our universe, or in the universe, in our solar system. And then we're trying to make these links to the ancient Greek Pluto, and suddenly you have this very strange, wishy-washy kind of pseudoscience that we're entering.
Yeah. And this is the other thing, is that Jyotish is the study of light. like that's actually what Jyotish means. Like that part of the word, like Jyoti means light. So Jyotish is the study of light. And so you cannot study light if there is no light being cast on the planets. Now, it's not to say that physically speaking, if astronomically speaking, there's no light from the sun reaches those planets, but the only reason why we're able to see the ones that are as close as they are, there's 7 classical planets, is because of the light of the sun. And it's the play of light off of those planets that has made them as visible as they are, right? In combination with their actual physical proximity to our planet and the sun. So when we're studying light, right, we're talking about celestial light. It's very difficult to do that when you're talking about planets whose light doesn't really seem to reach us in any, you know, meaningful way. It's something that's so difficult to do. You really have to like go out of your way to have any kind of interaction with it in a visual way or anything like that. So it seems to me that whatever representation they do have is alien or very much outside of the sort of consciousness that we're trying to operate in when we're doing astrology. It's and they move very, very slowly. The outer planets are incredibly slow. They make Saturn look fast. Like Saturn takes about 27 years to take a round trip through the Zodiac. I believe Pluto is somewhere in like around the range of like 250 or something like that. It's like it takes a long time to traverse the Zodiac. And so to try and attribute significance in a person's life to their Pluto placement is just so abstract. Like you're really talking about very not even generational. Like you could have two or three generations of people, or like completely encapsulated within one Pluto transit through the zodiac. Like just one year, a plutonic year, right? Or yeah, and so it doesn't really make any sense to me to pay such close attention to what the other planets are doing, even if we did have useful interpretations for their effect on the nativity or anything like that. It just gets kind of hazy because like you're talking about stuff that's just so general and it's really in the background, like right, because the further out in the zodiac, the further out in the solar system you go, the less personal the effect of the planet is. So the sun is very personal, soul, right? And then the moon, very close to our planet Earth, is the mind. The intellect, Mercury, is very close to the sun. Venus and Mars, which are these sexualizing planets, they have they're very close to the sun. Like, even Saturn, which is quite far away, its effect is more general, right? It deals with political upheaval. It deals with like suffering that is very much conditions like in your environment, which obviously not change overnight. So people born in the same 2 to 3 year period are going to have similar material conditions, right? That's what Saturn's dealing with, is the conditions through which you're going to move in life. Like the actual raw stuff is going to get thrown at you. You know what I mean? So not really practical to look at something like Pluto, which is moving so slowly. It's not really practical to talk about what is it doing. You know what I mean? So let's say we were going to get into reading those placements. It would be more effective to do that maybe and to understand them by looking at history and maybe tracking those transits over very long periods of time. Maybe we could get some kind of a pattern or understanding. It's not that they can never be used. It's just that I don't think it's terribly worth our while to worry about them or to really try and place them in rulerships over the zodiac.
Right. Yeah, like I just broke out this book of Western astrology here just briefly while you're talking so I could have a look and see what are they saying about the outer planets, and immediately it's just kind of, ooh, maybe I'll put this down and have a better look later. But yeah, it's saying, Pluto power plays are associated with these aspects and relationships, especially business and romantic partnerships, and all of tact and
Yeah, based on what?
See, yeah, and then when I flip forward here, it's giving some examples of some people here that we'll have to break this out and maybe see what the stars are actually saying for some of these people. Wow, this is kind of funny, Mr. Neal John. I'm sorry that I haven't opened this book of Western astrology in the last 5 years, or certainly I haven't opened it since I met you, but or I didn't mean to say since I met you, but since you introduced me to Jyotish. But yeah, they're giving some charts here for a Mr. Al Gore, a Mr. Tiger Woods, a Miss Oprah Winfrey. Who else do we have here? Ted Kennedy. Oh yeah, we'll have to talk about Oprah Winfrey's Pluto placement a little later, but we've got Willie Nelson, Tom Hanks, Robert Redford, Anderson Cooper, Brad Pitt, Condoleezza Rice. Stay tuned, everybody. I don't think we'll be going into Condoleezza Rice's Uranus placement or anything like that today, but I'll let Mr. Neal John get back to it.
So yeah, if anyone's curious why I'm not going to talk about at any point the outer planet rulerships of these signs, it's because it doesn't matter. And because if it is a thing and they do have rulership or partial rulership over these signs, it is overshadowed by the rulership of the 7 original classical planets.
Right, we're still analyzing that entire science, and there is a lot of insight to be gained from looking at that. So it makes more sense to focus on the aspects of it that we can gain a lot of insight to the nature of Jyotish upon.
Yeah. So back to Aries. Aries, speaking of, is ruled by Mars. And Mars deals with strife, but not in the purely, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but in the purely like traumatizing or like oppressive way that Saturn deals with it. Mars is more about struggles that we undertake and the things that we're actually, it's our striving, right? So Mars ruling over Aries tells us a lot about cosmogenesis and the beginning of things, because Mars is essentially this sort of initiating force that says, I want to be, I wish to become, I wish to not be what I am now, right? So it's very forward moving. And you can see that in the symbol for Mars. Just that little circle with the arrow coming out, right?
Right.
And so you see this thing bursting forth, right? It wishes to emerge, to become, to explode. And so Aries deals with that explicitly. Explosion, birth, the body. Aries is very body oriented because Aries represents the totality of creation as well. So you can almost see everything kind of being encapsulated in this sort of explosive Aries energy, right? And so the body is Aries. And when you see Aries in the chart, even if it's not in a house that's normally associated with the body, we should always compare or contrast that Aries energy with the house that it's currently, that it's found itself in. So you'll see Aries generally really pertains to health, to the constitution, to physical trauma, to birth, nature of the birth of the person themselves, and it just generally deals with a very physical, felt, immediate kind of phenomena. And as a result, if you look at the nakshatras within it, which we'll discuss in the future, like that, we can really break that down. Like we can even talk about the phases of procreation just using the nakshatras contained within Aries. Now, Aries, being ruled by Mars, is very friendly with the sun. Mars and the sun are close allies. So Mars actually creates an environment in Aries which the sun does quite well in. It's very powerful there. In fact, we call this exaltation. Every planet is exalted and in one particular sign, one particular Rashi, and is debilitated in one particular Rashi. which is actually always going to be the opposing Rashi, the one that's 7 houses away or 180 degrees away. So when I say that the sun is exalted in Aries, does not necessarily mean that it's good. You can have an exalted planet and it will actually exacerbate negative issues in the chart if it's in any way attached to something that's not good. Like you don't want an exalted sun, for example, in Aries in the 6th house of disease and enemies. That means you have powerful enemies, maybe even enemies that are quite impossible to overcome, because the sun is powerful. Sun's already authoritative. It's this very intense, boundless energy. Like nothing overcomes the sun. The sun will outlast the whole solar system, right? It's not this thing that fails over time. So the idea that just having an exalted planet is good in a chart is not true, and that's a misperception a lot of people have about exaltation. And the same thing with debilitation. People always assume it's bad, but once again, not necessarily. Debilitated, malefic in the right place. A malefic would be like a planet with negative connotations or generally negative effects. Can actually be good depending on the house. So there's it's not this simple thing where placement A is always good and placement B is always bad. There's so many things you have to consider in a chart. So keep that in mind.
I find that very
the next
interesting.
sign is Taurus. Yeah, Taurus is ruled by Venus. So you see, we kind of have this thing going on right off the bat with Mars and Venus. We have this masculine energy projecting outward into creation, and then we have this more receptive feminine energy accepting that and providing an environment wherein things can procreate and expand and grow and develop and diversify. And so Taurus deals with childhood. This is the actual life that is produced, and it's an earthy sign, very grounded, material, childlike, innocent. It deals with the felt experience of the body. So not the body itself, but the actual raw experience of possessing a body. So, and it also deals with the very first way that we interact with the world, which is our mouth. So the child doesn't actually, you'll notice there's we so much use its hands to understand the world because it doesn't have that manual dexterity yet. The child uses its mouth. Things are tasted, eaten. It really is about like these very primal, like deep down sort of things that are developed in the child psychology that deal with the experience of taste and smell and sight, just the stuff that really is happening right here, right? The head. But it really focuses around the mouth, and Taurus really deals with speech, not language. It's just like baby talk. It's just nonsense, right? But the vocalization itself is a very much Taurus thing. And Taurus deals with inheritance. So that's things that come to us from our parents, which makes sense. It deals with childhood and the childhood environment. Taurus is also mythologically, I would say, very deeply connected to concepts like the Garden of Eden or the state of innocence before the fall. In a lot of mythology, it deals with periods of plenty and joy and sort of carefree abundance that you see in a lot of mythology. There's always like this sort of part of the story where everything is great, right? And everyone has what they want, and there's no real trouble in the world. And if there is, no one's really aware of it or has any concept of it being bad, right? And then things take a turn at a certain point, right? So Taurus is this sort of innocence before all that happens. And you'll also notice that Taurus deals with money. So this is your finances in the chart. And so it pertains to the second house, which deals with all these things I've mentioned. But when we're looking at the second house in the chart, or if we're looking at Taurus, we can usually infer that money has some kind of relationship with the placement in question or the house in question. The next sign is Gemini. Gemini is intellect, the birth of intellect. So this is where self-awareness begins to happen. And you'll notice the symbol for Gemini is always two people. Now, there's a lot of debate and, I wouldn't say conjecture, but discussion about what these two people are. So they're either brothers or twins or they're lovers. That's a very common interpretation. The point is that there's two people, which means that there's observation. There's two like things observing one another. And that is actually what it's like to be a self-aware human being. You're not actually just one person in a way. You're always observing yourself. You're a self observing itself. So there's self and self-image, right? So in Gemini, that's what that's dealing with, is self-recognition, self-understanding, seeing yourself in a mirror, right? Once again, these two people, right? Like there's all these animals, for example, that cannot recognize themselves in a mirror because they're still in a sort of Taurus level of development. It's Gemini is self-awareness. There's this point where you transition into self-recognition. And that sets off all these different processes in consciousness where you start developing memory, you start developing points of reference and things like that that are abstract. So I'll say, this reminds me of, that is like, you know what I mean? You start making comparisons, you start tying things together and creating this sort of cohesive, holistic picture of the world that isn't based on your immediate experience, right? It's transformed by it, but it's not wholly consistent of things that are happening right now. So that's Gemini. It starts looking forward. It starts trying to develop a vision of what is going to happen. And you see that this is where humanity starts becoming humanity in a way. We're talking about the course of history. This is kind of that moment where you have tool use, you have language with actual meaning instead of just sounds, right? Instead of just these emotional vocalizations, there's like semantic content now. And that's actually where Mercury comes into play. Mercury rules Gemini, and Mercury deals with language. And Mercury deals with reconciliation of opposites. And it deals with the sort of union of the genders in a way too. Not in the sense of their annihilation, but I'm not talking about two things becoming one thing that is neither. It's more so Mercury is this meeting point between male and female where these energies can kind of exchange. And this represents communication, insemination, impregnation, all these different sort of psychosexual and lingual concepts kind of come up in Gemini. And once again, when we get into the nakshatras in the future, you'll see why that is and how that works, and how that transition between Taurus and Gemini really deals with that. But for now, Gemini is the birth of language, the intellect, self-awareness, and I would say that it's essentially where we start to actually see human consciousness emerge in the historical timeline. And this is also in mythology the moment of the fall. This is where self-awareness begets responsibility, which means there's actually a possibility to fail to meet responsibility. There's a consciousness there that is free to make mistakes now. It's not innocent anymore. And so there is this movement into a world where there are consequences, there's good and bad, there is judgment and discernment and discrimination, and we can start to actually pick things apart. And that means that we have the freedom to do good or evil. And so Gemini deals with this sort of moment, for example, in the biblical literature, where you have the apple of knowledge, or the fruit of knowledge is devoured. And so there's this entrance into self-awareness. But it also is a good thing. I mean, like, this is not a fatalist mythology. It's not a Christian mythology, ultimately, that the Zodiac deals with. And so this is an awakening of mankind to his spiritual potential as well. and to the prospect of the future and becoming more than he is as an animal. And so there is like a great wisdom and hope and optimism in Gemini as well. This all is third house stuff, right? And then the next sign is Cancer. Cancer is the mother, it's the home, it's the family in a way too. It really deals with group consciousness, family consciousness, sort of when you're a child, you're not really wholly separate from your parents or your mother, especially. You're kind of an extension of them for quite a long time, especially before you hit puberty. You're not really your own person. You're filled with their ideas. They provide the kind of the full palette of what's available to you is provided by your parents. So you're not even really going to be thinking of things they don't expose you to, or that you're not exposed to in the environment that they lay out for you or they permit you to exist in. And so Cancer deals with all that stuff. And it deals with the consciousness that we adopt as young people, right? Like we're not toddlers anymore, but we're not really out of the house either, right? So this is leading up to adolescence. And we're kind of just sort of like grappling with this sort of consciousness, like of I know I'm somebody, but I don't really know who that is, right? So there's a concept of self, but there's not full individuation. And so Cancer deals with that. But it's also just the home. It's literally the environment that you're raised in and the environment that you live in for your whole life. Like you'll always have Cancer in your life. No matter where you go, there's a place that's private. There's a place where you kind of melt into other people, where you have sort of a shared consciousness with people in your home. You all kind of have these things that you have these moments and these things you do together where some of the borders between you and other people kind of melt away a little bit, right? And that's because Cancer is like water. It's a water element sign. So it really deals with things that kind of flow together, and there's a sort of a cohesiveness to it. And it can be a trap for people. It can be a thing where people don't want to leave that. It feels very secure. And so your sense of security and home is really tied to Cancer in that way. And people who have, so people who have afflictions there and have trouble with their mother, maybe even their parents or their family generally, you can see issues with not feeling at home anywhere, right? And having a difficult time at home. The home maybe is in a constant state of disarray, or they have trouble keeping it clean, or there's a lot of issues with having to get repairs done all the time, or maybe it's not safe, right? So and you can go the other way too. Like the home could be this wonderful place that is enriching and a source of like wealth and prosperity and happiness. So Cancer can really provide any of those things, but it's really it's really about the environment that you're always in when you're in private. It's a private place you go back to, right? And there's a lot of safety there. But it can be smothering for some people. People drown in it and they don't ever really emerge, right? Like there's a lot of people now who are, for a lot of reasons, sometimes beyond their control, sometimes not, who can't leave their home. Like, you have young people living at home. And that's like this smothering Cancer energy. And the moon is the ruler of Cancer. So this is where we see the moon pop up, right? And the moon is a receptive place, you'll notice. It's a place that's, the moon deals with flux and change and cycles. And so there's a lot of emotion, right? There's a lot of ups and downs. Like this is not a world that's always necessarily stable either, right? And it's very easily influenced by what's introduced to it. It's absorbent, right? Like you bring negative influences into the home, it's almost like they seep into the walls, right? You bring around people into your home or into your circle, you will notice that negative influence will spread throughout the whole thing. It's because the moon cannot say no. Everything, it absorbs any light that's cast on it. And you see that with Cancer. It's very absorbent. So influences on Cancer are likewise quite noticeable. Like when Cancer's afflicted, or when it's got like a really good influence on it, it's very apparent because it's so reactive to influence. Its identity is very wrapped up in whatever's cast on it. Whereas there are other signs that kind of are more rigid, and they kind of steer planetary energy through them in a more specific way, or in a less receptive and like easily molded way. So there's something about Cancer in the chart where you really have to pay attention to where it's at. It's not like this thing where, like, you know, I say, oh, this so and so has Saturn in Cancer, and so that does this. Like, that's not really something you can say, because, now, for one thing, Saturn will have a very profound effect on it, but where it is in the chart, the aspects on it, like anything like that, it will completely transform the situation. So sensitive to every little thing, and so it can be one of the easier things in a chart to spot and read, and it can be one of the most difficult because of that, because it's so sensitive. You have to really know a lot about how things can be influenced in the chart to really tease out what's happening there. It can be a difficult place to penetrate as an astrologer. Even as a layman, like if you're just trying to understand that part of your life, you know, that it's a difficult place to kind of penetrate and really understand from an objective or clear-headed, like, you know, framework or context.
Mm. I'm finding all of this Cancer talk particularly interesting and applicable to me, being born in Cancer with the sun in Cancer, and also, unlike a lot of people, when they find the wisdom of Jyotish, I didn't have to go through the trauma of having to adopt a new zodiacal sign like most people often do, because I'm born basically just before the cusp of Leo, or a couple days before. So when we do the math and trace it back to 23 degrees, it turns out that I'm born with the sun in Purnavasu, the first, or that is, the first bit of Cancer.
First nakshatra of Cancer, yeah.
And so when you start talking about all of these aspects of home life, and the way that people will influence someone who, through the moon, who is a particularly like cancerous sort of person, and all of that started really resonating with me. All of those things that you were saying, it's very true. I am a very homebodied person in one way. I can find that would be a negative thing for me, that I do find it hard to break out of my shell, so to speak. Not to, I guess the pun was intended, you know, that Cancer, I think that's why they use the crab for the glyph, obviously, because it has like a hard outer shell, and then the you know, the sort of soft innards, like myself, being an emotional person. Like, I am an emotional person, as you were saying earlier, that can play out in a Cancer person in different ways. Like, I don't think that I'm a particularly emotional person in the sense that I go through big dips in a roller coastery kind of way, but I do experience emotion very, very intensely. And if you look at the four worlds of the physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual or creative worlds, I definitely am the most connected to the emotional and intuitional world. I would say that I am a more receptive sort of person when it comes to my magical practice. I lean more heavily towards mysticism in a way, even though in my practice within the tradition of the sabbatic craft per se, as you were saying, in relation to cycles and things like that, that is sort of the entirety of the nature of my personal practice, is studying the nature of the Sabbaths and the twilight points at the different markings of the wheel of time at midnight and sunrise and noon and sunset and yeah, everything that you were saying there was really felt like you were speaking directly to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and so another thing about Cancer too to understand is that we're talking about it in a historical perspective. Cancer deals with tribal society, so where we don't really have privacy, ironically, because Cancer deals so much with privacy, but that's because we live in a world where there are all these little separate homes, separate paradigms of privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in tribal societies, that doesn't exist very often. Like usually, there's a larger sort of um, umbrella of privacy that hangs over a tribe, a much larger group of families, right? And they tend to be towards more matriarchal forms of rulership or governance and social orientation. So
That's a
Cancer,
really interesting idea to me because what I picture, what you're talking about, is the idea of the home or the tribe being a much broader, larger family as we would
yeah,
have seen things in the past. And as we're moving forward in the modern dark age, that brings a sort of strange and almost painful idea to my mind of the fact that the idea of the home is getting smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that we are sort of crabbing up as people
yeah.
with modern day social media and things like that, right? And we maybe
Well, think
all could take a little bit of a lesson from Mr. Neal John here and make a bit more effort to break out of our comfort zones and get out of the home a little more and engage with our greater tribe.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that the tiny home movement is deeply tied to this restricted, heavily debilitated Cancer sort of situation where Cancer is almost, if we're talking about the overarching chart of humanity, if we're going to discuss things in that way, we can almost say the fourth house of North America of Western man is deeply afflicted, in the sense that he is now at a point where he is trying to find smaller and smaller places to live because there's the thought of having to fight so hard for anything larger than that. There's so much energy going the opposite direction that's trying to atomize you, and you're not even supposed to have even that almost. You're never supposed to really have a home. People are trying to fight for just this little scrap that they can call a home and just say, at least I have this. That is what a tiny home is to me. Someone saying, I refuse to let the walls close in anymore. And then when they build the house, you're seeing a physical representation of where they think the walls have closed into. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like
you're saying that the
someone,
tiny home movement is sort of this expression of the modern day sort of tiny dick energy that a lot of
yeah.
people seem to be exuding.
So what you have here is because look, you can have too much Cancer, right? You can your net can be cast too wide, and you can let all kinds of things in that you should not be letting in, right? You can open up your membrane, your border, your walls, your door. You can leave your door unlocked, your windows open, and things will get in that you don't want to get in, right? Your home without insulation is too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter, that kind of thing, you know. So a healthy Cancer says, you know, or a healthy Cancer energy is something that deals with a home that has borders that are not so strict, nothing can get in, because that's starvation, isolation, that's death, right? And they're not so weak that anything can get in and then likewise destroy it, right? And poison it. So, because Cancer is watery and water gets tainted, takes on things. You don't want your water just to have anything in it. That's not a good idea, right? And
Yeah,
so
that was
water
something you
signs.
Sorry, that was something you mentioned earlier, and I was going to say that that's something that particularly does reflect in my life, is that it's one aspect of Cancer that when you mentioned that, I was like, oof, yeah, that's kind of hard for me to accept, but it's true that, like, I even find myself taking on the voice of other people, or I speak more like the person that I'm talking to, trying to find this common ground, or I've always felt like I had no real, not that I don't have a sense of self, but that I don't have an attachment to a sense of self. I don't really give a flying if what people think of my character per se, right? Because I sort of acknowledge it as a character, and then I'll take on different sort of personas and different for different reasons or for different ends kind of thing. And I've almost taken that and run with it in my magical practice, even in that, like, I will take the idea of embodying different planetary forces and different archetypes and just sort of, I'll say to myself, okay, let's just get the ego out of the equation here and say, like, what's Jupiter saying today, right? Like, I'll just try to really embody Jupiter. And Mr. Neal John was saying to me earlier, we'll have a little laugh, I guess, just about where Jupiter is in my star chart one day in the future too, but I'll let Mr. Neal John get back to it for now.
Yeah, so Cancer is this thing that is, I think it's very instructive for people to understand because it deals so much with things that I think a lot of people are also uncomfortable talking about too, and just about where, where are the borders in your life? You know what I mean? And where are the limits? You know what I mean? Like, where are you hedging yourself in, and like, how permeable is the border? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Like, these are things that are not easy to address sometimes, and people don't like to think about it. And it's largely because we're forced in a situation where we don't really have control over our membrane, so to speak, right?
Right, and I just had a little bit of a insight there in that in the Kabbalah and in the tarot, the path that is associated to Cancer is Keth, and it joins Mars and Saturn, and that sort of goes into what we were just talking about an outward reaching and stepping forward into a sort of unknown territory, right? Because Mars is that outward reaching force, or that expansive force, and on the tree of life, it's the path that crosses the abyss, or goes over into the other world, the world of the gods, and experiences the womb of time, or the womb of the goddess kind of thing. So it represents going off into unknown territory very much, or almost like the hero's journey into the abyss.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. All the water signs deal with, in a way, darkness and plumbing the depths of darkness, and which is a difficult thing to explain only using the 12 Rashis. And so once again, this is something. Well, it's like kind of a teaser for the Nakshatra video and or podcast and article, because once we get into the nakshatras, you will understand why. Cancer is a much more like, well, they're all going to be more complexified by that, but I'm just saying that the water Rashis really take on a very vibe, realize what's going on in there and why it's like they are the way that they are, because the Western system doesn't really have a very sufficient explanation for the nature of these signs. But with the nakshatras, we can really break down some of the influences that are there that are clearly producing results. But you know what I mean? We need to know why. Like, what is it that causes this? And we can really get into that. Oh, pardon me. But for now, suffice to say, there is a hidden dark side to all these signs, but the water signs especially deal heavily with secrecy, hidden things, anything that is kept within and private. And so Cancer is probably the least secretive of the three water signs, but it still does deal with privacy and things that are kind of like hidden away and semi-clandestine, right? But it's usually more to do with like private stuff, family matters, right? Things that are shared between family and people who are really close to you or in the home. But it can also just be, you know, sort of like family secrets or the shame family carries, or there are things that can be hidden there. So yeah, like I said, we will get into that in the future. So moving on, now we have Leo. Leo is the Rashi ruled by the sun. Also, one thing you'll notice is that all the Rashis, right? You'll notice that every planet of the seven classical planets rules two Rashis, except for the moon and the sun. The moon and the sun only rule one, right? So the luminaries, which are the moon and the sun, only rule one Rashi each, and they're right next to each other, and they have a very intimate relationship for that reason. But Leo is individuation. So this is when we leave the home. We strike out on our own. Leo deals with individuation. It deals with confidence and self-actualization, realization. You're not just like aware that you are somebody. You're not just interacting with others in the sense that, like, you know, you like in this Cancer or Gemini kind of way where you're kind of like, okay, like I recognize that I'm something separate from the world that I'm in, but you don't really know what that means. There's no clear understanding of where you begin and the world ends. In Leo, there is a very defined concept of self, and this represents a level of maturity that produces authority and certainty and the ability to make decisions, to say, this is how it's going to be, this is what I want, this is what's important, this is what I will do, and I'm doing. You know what I mean? It's a really deals very, very strongly with the assertion of identity and the assertion of ego and the assertion of the self as something that acts upon the world instead of sort of being swept up in it. And so that's all very solar, right? Like the sun is the individual. It is completely independent. It produces its own light. Everything orbits around it. It's at the center of things. It's the very soul. Whereas the moon is just the experience of having a soul. It's like looking at yourself in the mirror. The sun is the actual self. And here it actually finally gets to shine. And you'll see how far in the story we're getting here before that happens. We're 5 signs in before the self really roars forth and says, like, I'm here and I have a design and a will. And I'm not just thinking about, oh, there is a future or there are other selves. I'm actually like, I'm going to strike forward and exact my will. That's what Leo is all about. And it deals with all basically exploring autonomy and agency, because you're not under the thrall of the mother anymore, or the home. You're outside. And so you can seek out romantic partners. This in dating and courtship, all these things are very much Leo related for that reason. This is like when you realize that, no one's looking over your shoulder right now, or if they are, they can't really tell you what to do. You know what I mean? You're not at home. So, this is when you strike out. It also deals extremely heavily with creativity. This is where you start producing things instead of being the product. And it deals with everything in your life that you create is ruled over by Leo. Everything you produce relates back to the 5th house. Leo's the 5th sign, and Leo. It all comes back to that, like everything that comes out of you, right? So as a woman, that's children too, right? Like now, that's not to say that men don't have a role to play in that process, but for women, the 5th house is really, really powerful because it deals with the actual thing they'll produce with their body should they choose to have a child. So you look to Leo and to the 5th house in the chart when we're trying to figure things out about children, right? The children of the person who we're charting. So
Can I
That's how we
ask a
get
quick question just
go for
before
it.
I forget it? Honestly, I find a couple aspects of the particular sort of transit from Cancer into Leo interesting, uh, based on what you just said. And a couple things are that first of all, it's as you were saying, that the moon and the sun only rule over one sign each, the moon ruling over Cancer and the sun ruling over Leo. And this is happening at the end of the first permeation of the cycle of the four elements within the zodiac. So we started with Aries, then we moved into Taurus, then we moved into Gemini, and then into Cancer. So we've gone from fire to earth to air into water, and then at the end of water we're going back to fire again. So it's almost
Correct.
this repetition of the initial seven sparks of creation that happened in Aries. It's almost so the sun and moon in paganism in the middle of summer are said to be joined in union, and all is right at summer's height, and they are married again. And now you're talking about just that, but from the astrological perspective, that the sign that is ruled by the mother or the moon and the sign that is ruled by the father or the sun are sort of having this interplay that leads to birth being the recreation of the
Correct.
creative cycle, but within the manifest universe, within our bodies.
Mm-hmm. In fact, this is actually one of the key. You picked up on something there really key, and like once again, when we do the Nakshatra series, this becomes way more apparent. But even here, you can see just through the elements. Every four elements, go through all four, and then it's almost like a recapitulation of the event of creation, right? So if we think of Aries as the advent of creation and as this sort of male exertion upon an uncreated or unmanifest substrate or substratum or reality, right? Then that's what it's the same thing. Leo does the same thing. It will produce this sort of reaction in the corresponding material world, right? The unmanifest world. It will make something out of nothing. And in this case, it's forming something out of this watery familial energy of Cancer, right? So there's this relationship between Cancer and Leo where there's this sort of undifferentiated mass that's been coalesced in Cancer, the family. And so Leo has to cut out something particular, something definite, something almost adult, right? Like semi-complete out of it. Has to say, we're gonna chop this out right here, right, with a cookie cutter. We're gonna say this is what a man is, this is what a woman is, this is what whoever it is, right? Like this is who the individual will be. Boom, right? And this is essentially us as teenagers. This is the Cancer to Leo kind of tumult, right? Where we're fighting for that and we're trying to figure it out. And then we make a decision and we kind of just project into that decision, right? We put all this energy forward into this decision. That's Leo. You can get stuck in there though, because when you produce a powerful self-image like that and you invest in it and put energy into it, it's very, very easy to get stuck there. Again, you can get stuck at any level of any point in the zodiac developmentally, right? And when you're stuck in Leo, you are someone who is never going to settle down, who is never going to relinquish themselves to anything. They do not surrender. They do not agree. They do not permit argument or opposition. And they're very headstrong, tyrannical. You can get really negative stuff out of it, right? If you're not careful, you can get all locked up in yourself and you know who you decided who you were, instead of realizing that this sort of individuation is actually meant to be a tool on a journey. It's not fundamental. It's not the end game. It's not what this is all really about. It's creating this one particular person that just exists forever. That's just not what this is about. And so that's the danger in that phase of development, and it's the danger of that house and afflictions of that house. And likewise, benefic results there are someone who's comfortable with themselves, who is assertive, who is capable of conducting themselves in the world with self-respect, and has a natural authority too. If people will respond to them, they find them convincing and endearing, and they tend to actually submit to them with very little, you don't need to be coerced, that's what I'm saying, right? It's natural authority. And so Leo deals with that, right? So, and same thing with the fifth house. And another thing too that's interesting is that in the historical perspective, this is the transition from tribal societies into something a bit bigger, right? Where you might have multiple tribes. You might have almost what you might call a kingdom. There is sort of an overarching authority that organizes the whole thing, right? There's a patriarchal force now that says, I remember, right? My father. I know who that is, right? And there's this concept of self, projecting self, of this sort of turtles all the way down kind of individuality. And that's what this patriarchal consciousness kind of constitutes. It's like there is a king, and then there are lords, and there are all these nobles, and there's all these distinct caste-like, projections. They're almost like roles in a play, like personae, right? And they're these very unyielding kind of things. And so class consciousness and hierarchical consciousness, the concept of top-down authority, all these things are born in Leo. This is where the world starts to organize under leaders, because now we're dealing with larger pools of resources, greater technology. We're dealing with individuated consciousness, which means people are making more independent decisions, which means there are greater consequences for those decisions. And therefore, there is a greater need for someone to be making decisions at a much higher level that will kind of constrain and prevent that from just flying off the handle. Because if you have too much individuation, everyone just kind of does their own thing and it becomes a big mess. And you have this sort of like hyper capitalistic almost, or I kind of associate it with like free market fundamentalism, people who are just all about like property rights and everything, that kind of like consciousness. And that's like hyper focused on this concept of like there's just me and what I want. That is Leo, out of control, right? That's that solar energy out of control. And so it produces this thing that's way too over the top if it's not controlled. So you need authority above authority above authority, right? And you can kind of have this more balanced thing where authority just serves a purpose. It says there are rules so that people, just don't do whatever they want, and things don't become chaotic, difficult to control, or fragile, in fact. When you have too much individuation, that's what happens. Things fall apart.
Right, I see the image of the chopping off of the head of the dragon, and then you're just left with Rahu. That's the image that came to my mind as you said that. It may not be an accurate sort of actual association.
It's kind of partially is in a way. Once again, that will be a nakshatra. It will be a nakshatra series, not a nakshatra video subject, because once again, like I can fully flesh that out for you when we talk about the nakshatras there. But for now, that's what happens with Leo. And like I said, so if there's a lot of affliction there, if things aren't functioning well, then we're talking about an individuation that is almost like if every organ in my body had a different idea about what it wanted to do, and there was no brain to order the whole thing, right?
Okay.
And you don't want a weak brain either, where that's not receptive to stimuli and information coming in, because then you can't make wise decisions either. You could be in control of the whole thing and still fuck it up. So, you know what I mean? There's always a balance with all these things. Some of this stuff is very obvious and intuitive too, right? Like it's not like these are new concepts, but when we map them to signs, we can start to see how the chart will actually draw an image or project an image of our lives and how we act and things that we do, and it will line up with that, right? Like we'll actually see how Leo and the fifth house in our chart will pertain to our sense of self and authority and individuation and the degree to which we think we're in control of ourselves, all those things. Impulse control, also the Leo thing, right? So that's all stuff you'll see in that part of the chart. Then you have Virgo. Virgo is where we start getting in trouble, right? Like we've had like some free will being introduced. We've got like familial consciousness, all these things happening. But Virgo is the very first time really in the whole story where there's a real pushback on development. Things start to slow down because we had all this individuation in Leo, right? We have all these people making decisions, drawing up borders, setting up self-limitations so that they can actually act in specific ways. So the specification complexifies the world and reality. And a complex reality is one that is more it's more difficult to navigate. You need to have a better idea of what you're doing, right? And there's more limitations, there's obstacles. And so Virgo is obstacles and navigating them with the intellect, because Virgo is the second sign ruled by Mercury. So this is the intellect. But the intellect as a means for understanding the world, interacting with it in an intelligent way, problem solving. It deals with time management, because we're now fully in the throes of time at this point in historical development. Because in like the prior phases of development, time is more dreamlike, more episodic, or vignette-like. It's not, people don't have these distinct modern concepts of time where people are counting down seconds and minutes and hours and days, and we have calendars, all these things. Like that's not going on in Leo and Cancer, right? In Virgo, it's very much a reality. Things are regimented now. There are very specific, highly patternized, reticulated structures now. And this is where we start seeing development of cities and this sort of metropolitan expansion. This is the sign of empires and civilization. We're really starting to break out into what we would almost call recorded history, right? Mankind is like really developing here, right? We have technology, it's rapidly expanding. Virgo's all about complexification, complication, and therefore complications in any avenue of life. Like all the stuff that goes wrong in your plans because you didn't think of everything, this is Virgo. It's your enemies. It's literally other consciousnesses working against your own, right? That's Virgo energy. That's all Virgo stuff. And Virgo deals with disease. Any kind of entropy that results from complexity is a Virgo thing. So disease, poor time management, enemies, just, the consequences of living in a very large, multifaceted, hierarchical, and complex society. That's Virgo stuff, right? And within Virgo, we see this transition start to happen where people are kind of really separating, coming apart, and there's like, a lot of conflict on a civilizational level. And then it'll happen in your own life. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's the part of your life where you start actually having trouble with other people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like this emotional, impulsive stuff like you experience when you're really young, like bullying or, this more like just for the moment stuff. It's far more interpersonal and a lot more animosity in a Virgo kind of experience, right, with other people. It's dealing with actual calculated opposition and enemies. But Virgo also conversely deals with healing, deals with resolution of problems, problem solving too, right? Like, and we're talking about figuring things out.
So in that way, we're coming back to each one of the signs sort of having this opposite sort of reflection version of itself.
Yes. And Virgo is earthy, right? So this is actual implementation of design, written language, like invention, like technological advancement that actually produces physical things, right? And machinery, clockwork is very Virgo. Like clockwork is probably one of the most Virgo things that you can experience, because it's all about this idea of producing this thing that operates in a reticulate or very organized and almost a mechanical way. Virgo is mechanical, right? So then the next thing we move into, right, is Libra. Libra is Venus ruled, and it's an airy nakshatra, right? Gemini, very airy, right? So all this solidity and getting weighed down by details, things start to loosen up here. And Libra deals with friendship and contracts and oaths and alliances and bringing things together. And so this is sort of the resolution of a lot of issues that are introduced in Virgo in a way. And now we're almost dealing with like how connections are being made in very complex societies, right? And that's why it deals with marriage, because that's actually how a lot of conflicts were resolved in times. Like, you know, like you had warring nations when they made peace. Wasn't terribly uncommon for royalty to be married to one another from opposing nations, right? That made peace. It was a way to solidify that, create a link. Right? So Libra deals with these connections that we make, right, with others in this complicated world. So there's all this friendship and romance, and it's not like the kind of explorative or like curious sort of romance or more sexual almost exploration that you see in Leo. It's much more, there's much more depth to it. It deals a lot more heavily with like looking ahead and sort of seeing these connections as being lasting and binding. And so it creates a lot of like strength in connections and produces bonds on a very large scale. And also on an intimate scale. Marriage is obviously an intimate thing between two people. And well, in most societies presently anyway. So marriage brings two individuals together, and they will now their karmas are linked, right? Their possessions become linked. Libra deals quite heavily with material enjoyment for that reason, because this is actually where the party really starts. Because all this stuff that was made in Virgo and all this individuation that happens in Leo, all these things, now we actually kind of get to enjoy it a little bit. There's an opportunity for these things to just sort of be experienced for what they are, and to do so at least semi-harmoniously with others. And so celebrations, parties, anything that deals with just enjoying what you have with other people is very much a Libra thing. Yeah, and you know, any social bonds that we create in our lives, we can look to Libra and the seventh house, right? And you'll notice that, like Gemini, we're talking about something very social again. So the air signs always a social factor. So Gemini is communication, actual semantic exchange. We're using sound or something to transmit semantic content to someone else's mind, and then they bring it back to us, right? And so Gemini deals with learning for that reason, right? So Libra is social again, but it's more expansive, and it's deals with interaction on a larger scale, not the largest scale, but a larger scale. We're dealing with like interpersonal interactions now, right, between more than two people that aren't family members necessarily, right? That aren't intimate people that we grew up with. So that's Libra. And this is also in a way kind of I would almost say like the height of civilization. This is right before things start getting ugly again for mankind, because it's kind of where we kind of get to enjoy everything we've created, but it also is the beginning of a lot of decadence and hedonism. Libra can be very hedonistic, and you start to really see this sort of materialism set in too, civilizational. Talking about the Libra phase of civilizational development. Now we're heading into Scorpio. Right? Scorpio has a pretty nasty reputation in the West, and it's not much better in the East. There are some things about it that I believe to be somewhat unique in terms of interpretation and symbolism in the East, but it's still not a pretty sign. We're back into a water sign again. Unlike the group consciousness of Cancer, this is more almost like subconsciousness. This deals with parts of ourselves that we don't really even want to acknowledge exist. This is sort of the underbelly of things. It deals with the underworld, subterranean realms. It deals with what is beneath the earth. It's actually ruled by Mars, interestingly enough. And this is sort of Mars's exploratory sort of function, carrying it into the underworld. Right? Mars is almost like burrowing into the earth here, and it's moving into this subterranean sort of place. It's almost like the catabasis, the journey of the hero into the dark underworld, right? Looking for some kind of a treasure or this thing that he can bring back up in triumph, right?
Right, and what I'm seeing when you say that is sort of the idea of Mars's aspect of as you're saying, going in to the underworld, representing. I'm picturing Scorpio being associated to the Death card of the tarot, and that you were saying that Mars rules over Scorpio, and that there's this entire, again, sort of an interplay between the same Mars and more Saturnian or underworld forces, and we've discussed previously, and this will have to be another thing for the Nakshatras in the future, the nature of Saturn's relation to Scorpio, but I'll let Mr. Neal John get back to it for now.
Yeah, so Scorpio is hidden things too, in a way that Cancer simply is not. Like Cancer, like I said, deals with privacy and stuff, but this is so much more than that. This is secrets and humiliation and shame, all the stuff that like about yourself that you've tucked away, even maybe from yourself, you don't want to remember, repressed memories. It deals with karma as well, things that we've inherited from other lives, and it deals with sudden losses and gains, things that just come out of the blue, like just out of the dark, you know.
And I think a lot of the negative associations with Scorpio in the West have to do with, again, that time around the movement from BC into the current era. Around that time, Scorpio would have appeared on the western horizon, so it's the land where the sun retreats to at night. So it would be, I believe that it was associated with death around those times for that reason as well, and would be maybe interpreted as a particularly inauspicious sign, I guess, for that reason.
Yeah, it is strongly associated with death, and strongly associated with longevity as a result. So if you can actually use Scorpio and the 8th house in the chart to determine the lifespan, right? It can tell you about how long someone will be around. And it can actually be a very positive thing in that way. It can be a very strong indicator for health. You can really look to Scorpio for a lot of information about someone's lifelong health. The only thing about doing the death reading, so to speak, is that once you learn how to see death in a chart, you will wish that you hadn't, because you might find yourself thinking about or looking at or remembering your own chart. You do not want to get locked into that, starting to agonize over your death, right?
Right. My mother saw a fortune teller when she was young that told her she was going to die at 77, and she's never stopped talking about it her whole life. Right? She's just fixated on the idea that she's going to die at 77. She's going to watch this and listen and send Mr. Neal John a message, probably asking him what he thinks about that.
Yeah.
She's literally obsessed with it.
And yeah, and for that reason, I do not tell people when they're going to die, and I don't spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out how that particular part of Scorpio works in the chart, because I don't think it's healthy. It doesn't do anyone any favors. You're not going to get anything out of finding out when you're likely to die or how you're likely to die. I have in the past done charts where I have figured out how people have died. Right? But it's never the person of the chart. I've used it to figure out when a parent or a sibling will die, and not when. If I saw it, I would never say anything. But if I saw something about a parent who I knew to be dead, I could quite reasonably, and I have made pretty accurate descriptions of death, like what has happened to someone who's perspired in a chart, who's related to or somehow has a relationship with the client. But I would never, ever, ever, and nor should anyone else, personally, I don't think, tell someone what they think their death is, for when their death is going to occur, and in what way, for two reasons. One, when you read a chart, you actually take on part of the karma of your client, because you are giving them expectations and instructions and perception of their life. So even if you were wrong,
That's an amazing concept.
You're influencing their decisions now. So you have effectively participated in their karma in a very conscious way. You know that you're doing
absolutely. Yeah.
So you have to really think about what you're telling people, and try to always put a positive spin on things. And now look, anyone who's done who's worked with me and who has had my an essay written by me for them describing their chart, they will see I will get into some pretty ugly stuff sometimes. I'll tell people about all kinds of things that have happened to them, or that I think that they deal with, that I think are could easily be described as negative or not so nice. But it's always with two main things. You want to always assure the client that this is not doom. It's not written in stone. Things can be done about this stuff. And we review the past, because if we cannot understand and reconcile with it, it will poison our future. That's relevant to Scorpio, because the things that you don't want to deal with, the things that you hide away and that you try to push out of your mind, that's the 8th house. That is Scorpio, and that is not stuff that you want to have hanging over you, because it will affect you. It's still going to do something. It doesn't go away. And so Scorpio and the 8th house are like this little hole in your chart where you stuff all the crap, right? You just fill it with all the excrement of your life, and you just hope that it doesn't bubble back up. You can overdo that. It will overflow, right? You have to go down in there and figure it out, because it's not going to go away. And so this is really, Scorpio is self-reckoning. Some people can't deal with, if we're going to extend that metaphor, their own shit, right?
Right.
People don't like to go down into their own personal sewer and root around. And they especially don't want to sift through anything to find the stuff that they never should have thrown away, which is what Scorpio is really, really about. So important to understand that, is that there is stuff we all have gotten rid of or ignored that we should not have, not simply because it needs to be reconciled or accepted or dealt with, but because there may actually be something of value there, like genuine value, that we can instrumentalize in our lives right now. And we should confront that stuff so we can do that. Now, for some people, that's incredibly painful, and it might be something that could take you the rest of your life to do. You might not get there. Who knows, right? Like, it's some people have endured things that we can't even imagine. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, like, it's just as easy for them to do this as it is like someone who's just uncomfortable with their foot fetish or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like everyone has the same problems, but some effort should be made to deal with those issues in a productive way, and to see things as not being completely irredeemable or condemnable, and therefore there at least something can be pulled out of that. That's what really Scorpio is about, is instrumentalizing some of the ugly stuff that you've had in your life, and at least getting something out of it, because it already happened. You might as well do something with it, right? And to make sure that it doesn't become a negative thing in the future. Introduce a little sunlight to it, almost, right? And yeah, so Scorpio is like basically it's a reckoning yourself, and on a civilizational level, it is a reckoning with the sins or the guilt of a nation or of a people. And so when there's a Scorpio phase, historically, we're really dealing with mass guilt, mass sort of confrontation with what no one wanted to talk about. It's like talking about homelessness, right? We're going to talk about that civilizational scale. Like Scorpio is like trying to deal with homelessness. It's this ugly, gross thing, produces, some ugly, gross people sometimes, right? And like stuff that we really don't want to deal with, and it disgusts us. And it's like, oh, like, you don't want to be around it. Scorpio will not go away, and you got to deal with it, right? Like, so there's lots of issues like that in society. There's lots of things that we don't want to talk about or confront, deal with, and like that's what Scorpio is. And the more we try to put that off, the worse it's going to get. So that's a big thing, right? And here's the other thing too. This is really interesting: is that the 8th house and the 7th house are far more interrelated than people realize. There's a lot of people who kind of just sort of cut them right off, and they're just not seen as continuous with one another, but they are. The 7th house, the experience of marriage, is not the 7th house. That is the forging of relationships. It is the creative moment. It is the contract. It's all the stuff that everyone gets to see, the actual intimate experience, especially the consummation. That is in Scorpio. Scorpio deals with sex. And sex not as procreation, but just sex, period. Just eroticism. And so the act of having a sexual relationship with an intimate other is a Scorpio thing. Scorpio deals with fetishes, deals with sexual ideation and consciousness that is separate from procreation. And this kind of ties into the Mars rulership, because Mars is a sexual sign. But this is Mars not being procreative like it is in Aries. It's Mars just being sexual. It's the raw sexual energy of Mars.
And also what you were saying, it draws to, or about fetishes and sort of aspects of the self that you may not be able to accept, or that may be darker or a little twisted in your mind or something like that. Again, we're showing the symbolism of what you're saying earlier about Mars in its rulership over Scorpio, this idea of going out, not simply an expansive force, but the idea of going into unknown realms.
Yeah.
But it could be not simply just going into those realms and experiencing, all of these lewd or crude or vulgar things, as you were saying, but maybe for the purpose of transformation.
Correct. You're not meant to get trapped down there. You're not meant to take that stuff on, right, and become it. You're meant to confront, understand, and integrate it, right? Like, it's not meant. This is not meant to be a thing where a good Scorpio experience is becoming a degenerate, right? Like, we're not saying that. I'm not. That's not to say that everything sexual that isn't procreative is degenerate. I'm not getting at that either. All I'm saying is that there's a healthy way to do that, and there's an unhealthy way to do it.
Right.
Unhealthy Scorpio stuff is addiction, sexual promiscuity, extramarital relations, secrets kept from the wife or the husband. It deals with sexual energy that is misplaced or misused or invested in something that it should not be. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in Scorpio. It's a very dense, complicated sign. You could talk about it all day. You know.
And you just triggered my, oh, sorry. I was just going to say that you triggered my memory to something that I wanted to touch upon before we moved on from Scorpio. And what we're talking about right now with the Mars rulership over Scorpio, it brings to mind again what you were saying earlier about the fact that when we interact with other people, that we are taking place in their karma. We have that is our is say yourself and the other person's self both experiencing an interlaced aspect of karma, because karma simply meaning action, right? Not taking it from this Western perspective of punishment or reward according to your action, but simply the results of your action. That every time that you come into someone else's life in any way, or any time that you come into someone's experience in any way, that you are sharing a karma. And so in that way, I'm looking at Mars and Scorpio representing, a negative way that you can do that, in that or as you were saying earlier, the idea of trying to use knowledge that's kept within, or if you were to give someone information about their death, that wouldn't necessarily be beneficial knowledge for them to have, and that you are actually having a sort of negative interaction with their karma. So it just brought to mind, and I thought that before we moved on, that just we should bring, that I thought that it was, you brought up something really powerful there, and that we should really kind of drive that home before we move on from Scorpio, and that there is a responsibility associated with power, or with having obtained some sort of knowledge of the inner workings of the universe, or having obtained some sort of power, or siddhis, as they would call it in Sanskrit, that you have to think about the power of that, and not use it as a tool for evil, so to speak, right? Like because and so, listen up, Western astrologers, when you know that you're giving people information that's just bunk, and you are giving them information that a person is going to use and go on in their life and take that and run with it, you're potentially altering the course of this person's life in a drastic way, because what we believe has so much power over what we do in our life and what we make our karma, that if you can come into someone's life and influence it in such a profound way, that you have to take into consideration the responsibility that comes along with that.
Yeah, this is another thing I want to touch on very, very quickly. A huge disclaimer here. I do not play nice with Western astrology. Some people who practice Jyotish or do this, like, have this kind of more lukewarm, like, well, I don't do that, but whatever, It's like, no. I think it's harmful for that explicit reason. Is that there is no concept of responsibility for doing readings in Western astrology. It's not part of the culture. That, to me, is harmful. Secondly, it can only be harmful because it's inaccurate. And I've got into that in the past. I won't rehash it here, but it's inaccurate. And so only do harm. To only give people the wrong information. That's no good. Thirdly, there's no onus upon the Western astrologer, because there's no real, like, deeply rooted tradition that's unbroken, that goes straight up to the present day. It says, as a Western astrologer, you should practice some form of religion, and you should have some kind of moral code and a guiding tutelary deity. Like if you're a Jyotishi, it is considered incredibly vulgar and inappropriate and just all around wrong to not have a religious practice while you're doing this, because you do need something above you coming down and influencing you and helping you give your reading something more than just like, you know, an analytical or just more, you know, mundane consciousness to them. Like you don't want to just analyze a chart as though you would say, like, you know, a book or something like that, where it doesn't
Right.
matter
I
if you
don't.
get it right, or it doesn't matter. Um,
Oh, I was going to say that I
like
just
having a
don't.
religious context for your work is vital.
Yeah, I don't see there being
Pardon?
much of a. I was going to say I don't see there being much of a logical way to synthesize the systems of Jyotish and atheism.
No, can't be done. Can't be done. And for some reason, I'm not sure why, but there are Western astrologers who claim not to believe in deities. And it's because there's a lot of pseudoscience that gets wrapped up in Western astrology. They'll try and justify the science of it by saying there's undiscovered physical forces that the planets exert, and that's what's doing it. There's no there's there really are entirely materialist interpretations of astrology in the West, and this is one of the major reasons why it's harmful, because it's not grounded in anything that's spiritual. There's no reason for a person who's practicing it, and there's no one telling them to either. Like, you know what I mean? To say like you should have appealing to something, a higher intelligence guide you, even if it's only semi-consciously. Like, you know what I mean? Just that, even that flash of inspiration that you get when you're doing a read, and you're like, oh, like that's something I should say. I'm not quite sure how I got from A to B sometimes, right? Like you'll do a read and like you'll have like a general concept of something that's happening in, like, say, in a particular conjunction, but there's this little flash of insight that says there is a gradation of detail here you can go into, and you should just do that. Like there's just this, you should go all in on this very specific interpretation, and that's just the way that it is. Sometimes there's this little leap that goes just beyond what's available, right? There's like a general direction, and then it gets hazy. Sometimes you just get this flash of insight that takes you a little bit further than that. You need that, right? And you need to have something over you that has a perspective and a sort of a compassion, right, for the people that you work with, and that you are working with, right? Like, and doing charts for. So I like to think that because I myself am a pagan and I do worship deities that I believe have my interests and the interests of my clients at heart, that I'm able to do better work for that reason. Oh, and that's something I think people should take on and, like, you know, understand when they're thinking about, right? Like, you know, why would you trust somebody who doesn't really have anything holding them down, or that holding them account? You know what I mean? Like there's no, like, who is a Western astrologer responsible for, and like who do they answer to? It's just themselves, and like some crystals and like a half burnt thing of sage in the corner or whatever the hell's going on. Like, you know, it's not anything to put your trust in, right? So,
Right, we're getting back
you
to
know, you
what
gotta
we
take
were
my
talking.
word too at the end of the day. I'm not,
We're getting back to what you're talking
pardon?
about. We were getting back to what you were talking about earlier when you're talking about Leo, and when there's no authority and there's no system, you just have this unrestrained sort of ability to go off into nowhere land in that situation or something, right? And the person can sort of
Yeah.
just go further down the pooper with Western astrology or whatever. And, you know, I think at this point, yeah, there was a period when I was first introduced to Jyotish that I sort of, it's like, oh, it blew my mind, and I didn't want to really backtrack and be like, oh God, everything I've learned about astrology is wrong. But sometimes you just got to accept that you're wrong and then move forward, right? So I think at this point we can pretty much say that we've all heard it from the source, Mr. Neal John here, that Western astrology can be listed amongst the black dharmas. It's just leading people astray, and we should all just leave it in the dust and move on to something better.
Yeah, call it out, like I do. You know,
Call out culture, man. That's what I'm into. Let's call it out. Let's call them out for what they are.
Yeah, but I don't play nice with it, and I'm not rude, but I don't play nice with it, and I call it out for what it is. It's
no, fair enough, right? It's like you can't blame somebody for not wanting to feel like they've wasted their entire life in a system that ends up being nothing, and that they've been just like creating this hall of mirrors for themselves and playing games with with all of this. But you know, when the evidence is put on the table, you just can't deny it, right? Like, I never resonated with Western astrology in my life. There were aspects of it that resonated with me. I always felt that the symbols of the planets and the zodiacal signs, that they had this truth, and I couldn't piece it together. Why do I not feel anything about this, right? Like, and it's because I was trying, the calibration system is off by almost 2,000 years at this point, you know. And it's like, oh, and earlier when you were talking about Virgo, I was thinking, I was like, oh, and it made me realize that, and I've never really done this calculation yet, but I grew up under the impression that both of my parents were Virgos. And this was an issue for me in my mind, right? I'm like, oh, like, why would the gods send me down here to a couple of Virgos or whatever? And then when you were in the middle of it, I was like, wait a minute, I was born to 2 Leos, right? And it makes total sense too. Like, my mother is very fiery. Like, anyone who knows my mother, she has high, intense energy like me. She could talk to you all day. You say the wrong thing, she's gonna tear a strip off of you. Like, she's a very fiery lady. And then my dad, I was like, oh, my dad's not like that. No, my dad is like this Wizard of Oz gentle lion figure, right? The big mustache, and he's a, God rest his soul. Your dad has a little bit of that gentle lion thing going as well. God rest his soul.
Yeah, in a different way. Yeah. In a different way, yeah.
Oh, not so gentle. In his old age, Mr. Gregory MacRae, he softened up a little bit, but I guess you could say that Mr. Neal John's father led a pretty wild life in his youth, we'll put it that way. There may have been a bit of a Mars and Scorpio placement going on there or something. I'm just kidding. I love Mr. MacRae very much so, and I like to think that he's having a laugh with us right now too. So, but yeah, he does have that kind of lighty thing. I guess I'll just take this opportunity to tell the story of the first time that I ever met Mr. Gregory MacRae. I was cleaning up the living room at our past residence where Mr. Neal John and I about 5 years ago lived together, and a big loud knock comes on the door, and I look through the peephole and I see what looks like a slightly shorter and more stocky version of Mr. Neal John, suspenders and a plaid shirt, and then slightly younger and pretty much another person who looked exactly like Mr. Neal John, but a bit younger, who is his brother Luke. I know what's going on here. So I open the door. Immediately the man says, "Who are you?" So I chuckle. I say, "I'm Jared. I live here. Who are you?" Knowing very well who he is. And he reaches out and grabs my hand and he says, I'm Greg MacRae. I'm Neal John's father. To which I said, of course you are. You're crushing my fucking hand right now. And that was the first time I believe that I met Luke as well. Yeah, it was, because I'd never seen him before. I was like, well, this guy looks exactly like Neal John. Crushing handshake as well, you know, as it should be. But anyway, carry on, Mr. Neal John. Let's perhaps maybe move on from Scorpio now and get into a little bit of Sagittarius action. We've got another expansive kind of fiery sign sort of thing going on here.
one thing I will say about Scorpio before we leave
Yeah.
behind is that not everything down there needs to get dragged back up. We talked a little bit about, I mentioned the idea of going down there to find something of value and take it back up, like a treasure. Not everything that's down there is treasure. Not everything should be taken back up. You know what I mean? Not all that glitters is
Fair.
gold. So yeah, just be wary of that. Just because it's down there doesn't mean it's good. You know what I mean? There are some things that stay there. You know. So anyway, I'll get into that in the future. Once again, we're not talking video.
Or stay there or be transformed by the sort of Saturnian influence over Scorpio, which again we'll have to talk about in the future episode. Okay.
But yeah, so then you have Sagittarius. So Sagittarius is another rebirth. This time, now that the Scorpio phase of development has gone through, so we've done this real self-introspection. We've
come to the end of that four-stage cycle again, right? We came to the end of it at the end of Cancer, and then it's repeated in Leo, and now we've gone through the four elements again to come to the end of Scorpio. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we've gone through the sewer. We've actually found this golden thing, this treasure, this fleece, this whatever it is, the golden fleece.
So they brought back some sort of nugget out of all the shit that was down there in the underworld of Scorpio, you're saying?
Yeah, there's like a holy grail down there, right? I want to use that specific term for a whole bunch of reasons, and I will love
more associated with Cancer, as we were talking about earlier, being the chariot and the tarot,
But there is a relationship between Scorpio and the Grail. I'll love to get into it with everybody sometime, but once again, the future. So there is a treasure down there. Once it is brought back up, this means that we've gone through this purification, right? Scorpio is the initial process of purification. It's almost like a preparation for it, really. So once we figure out what's valuable, what's not, what's left to do, you get rid of everything that's no good. There's an annihilation of all the prior things that are garbage, that are no good. It all gets burned away. This is Sagittarius. The initial explosive force of Sagittarius is a transformative event that blows away all of the detritus and the baggage and attachments and all these things that hold us back. So all this stuff you've been carrying around your whole life, you didn't want to deal with, you've dealt with it. And now we're going to get rid of it. It's gone, right? You're going to leave it behind. You are going to get to the root of yourself in a way that you weren't able to before. It will become clear and bright, and it's this fire energy of Sagittarius. And this is the first time we see Jupiter as a ruler of a Rashi. So Jupiter is the guru. It's actually a word that is used to describe Jupiter. It's an epithet for Jupiter that's often used in the Jyotish tradition. So you might see someone say someone has guru in a particular placement, right? And they're talking with Jupiter. Jupiter is also called, as we've spoken of before, Brihaspati, which is a more common term, or I should say name for planet. But
what was it called? The audio broke up there for 1 second. Sorry?
Brihaspati.
Brihaspati. Okay, thank you.
Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but yes. So Sagittarius is initiation into higher learning and into higher consciousness. The fiery quality of Sagittarius can also be seen as a sort of like a completion or an achievement of sort of a Kundalini experience of the fire in the head, as it's sometimes called. That experience is Sagittarius. It is an intuitive, inspiring flash that yields transformation, that produces a higher-minded way of looking at things. And interestingly enough, Sagittarius is the opposite of Gemini. So we have Gemini dealing with the first sort of baby steps on this journey of learning and self-understanding, and it deals with lower forms of education, like grade school and learning trades, things that are a little more mundane or not quite as abstract. And then Sagittarius is like higher learning. So you're going to university or studying philosophy or religion or anything that requires a great deal of depth and abstract thought. So Sagittarius deals with that. Sagittarius also deals with long distance travel, foreign places. And so this all kind of deals with everything being new, the world being transformed through this process we've been through. And this is a time of like high culture in the historical record. This would be deal with like almost like a renaissance in a way. So we've kind of sifted through the garbage and we found all this stuff in the past, all these things that were kind of lost or hidden away that were actually quite valuable or interesting and be revisited. That's the Renaissance, right? So that we can kind of almost see that as sort of being a Sagittarius experience or a phase of development in the West. And the reintroduction of alchemy to the West, I personally see as being sort of a Sagittarius thing. And because it occurred during the Renaissance, and symbolically speaking, once again in the future, I'm going to break down how precisely alchemy and Sagittarius are very deeply related for a lot of reasons. Alchemy, I mean, you could get into how alchemy kind of plays into the whole Zodiac, and there's a whole thing going on there, but there's a very special symbolism of the Sagittarius. Once again, we'll get into that another time. So Sagittarius deals with higher learning, and it also deals with teachers, people who teach us in our life. And it deals with gurus, and it can deal with the father, but not just as the person who sired you, but the person who raised you and taught you. You know what I'm saying? The actual tutelary and intellectual kind of more cerebral aspects of fatherhood are really represented in Sagittarius, and the softer hand of the father. So as opposed to the more disciplinarian or more solar kind of concept of the father, this is more like the softer hand, the generosity of the father. And Sagittarius is very, very auspicious. It's a really lucky sign. Deals with just, things going right and abundance and the gathering of resources, both spiritual, material, intellectual, all that stuff, right? So yeah, it's just a fun sign. It's just something that doesn't often pertain to a lot of negativity in the chart. It's a nice sign. Now, that's not to say you can't have afflictions there. Sagittarius, because it's ruled by Jupiter, deals with the law. And so this can deal with how we relate to the law, right? An afflicted Sagittarius could suggest that someone perhaps is on the wrong side of it quite a lot of the time, or engages in illegal activity, or perhaps sometimes if there's a connection between Virgo and Sagittarius, that can imply a lot of litigation, a lot of like stuff in courtrooms happening in your life.
That comes to mind when you said that Jupiter is typically a good sign in a chart, but that obviously it can have placements that make it not so much. There can what came to mind to me was too much of a good thing. It isn't a good thing, right?
And once again, there is this arrogance that comes with all the fire signs. They all can produce arrogance and a sort of stagnation resulting from it. And so Sagittarius can be a place where you kind of think you're better than everybody, right? And that you're above the law, or that you have this, you're initiated now, so people are lesser than. So you might act, which is not inaccurate. It's not like you haven't improved in a way that maybe others haven't, and then maybe you're in a position to tell them things and speak authoritatively, on something, or have a position of authority. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not an anarchist, you know what I'm saying? But Sagittarius can produce people who are almost know-it-all energy. Someone who kind of thinks that they don't need to learn anything else. They're the master now. there's this sort of false completion that can happen in Sagittarius.
That makes
And
sense with the symbolism of, from what I know of Sagittarius being associated with the craft, and with in the tarot, Sagittarius is known as the arch card, and it shows an image of the cauldron, but the person is split into two, into their masculine and feminine energies, and there's the eagle and the lion that represent these other two different forces within alchemy, and the blending of all the things within the pot towards the goal of higher transformation, kind of thing, right? And so that card very much involves the process of initiation in that way, or of
yeah, well, here's the thing. This is where it gets really neat, is that, so we know how we talked about how Aries, the first fire Rashi, is the body.
yes.
The second one is what? We produce another kind of body there, the individual, the self-image as something concrete and sturdy and useful that can operate within its own kind of a world. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And then Sagittarius is a production of yet another body. This is a body produced from a state of initiation. So we're dealing on a much more subtle level now. We're almost like dealing with constructing
the self that's created consciously.
Yeah, because we're operating with actually like creating and designing the etheric or astral. Well, not I wouldn't say astral. The etheric body, the body of the spirit, like how we traverse in other worlds, so to speak.
Right, and that's
And
sort of
this
shown
is like
in the...
our armor, right? Or it could be. Pardon?
I was going to say that idea is sort of implicit in the glyph for Sagittarius, in that, like Mars, it is a arrow pointing up and diagonally, but this one has the line is crossed, as if to say that it's gone over into the other world, or that it's crossed, or that the energy is being projected beyond.
No, correct. And so this is actually a stage of preparation, not an end. That's the thing, is that it can become a false ending. People can get very enamored with what they achieve in that phase of development. A lot of people don't even get there.
Okay, so I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying with the know-it-all energy associated with it, or the false assumption that it's sort of the end of the process rather than the process itself.
Yeah, and so most people today, and look, I'm just as guilty as everybody else of not being like, this amazing guru or whatever. I'm not like some spiritual master. I don't want to put that out there either, right? Like, I've read a lot of this stuff, and like I do practice, I do things, but like most people do not get to this point in their life. It's just not happen, right? Most people get to Libra, and then they're like pushing up into the Scorpio stuff, and they just get caught up in that until they die. You know what I mean? They're just, going back and forth between trying to deal with their shit and getting tired of it, and then retreating back into the comfort and sort of hedonism of Libra, and they just do this.
Right, they've made it far enough in the process that they've come to a point where it's like, oh, okay, I've sort of found a bit of a happy place, and then they become comfortable there and don't move forward beyond it, you're saying.
If you look at the Indian chart, North Indian chart, right, how it's structured, the first house is right here, seventh house is right here. So if you think about the journey, the thing moving through the journey, having any kind of weight, this is where you end up when you're at the seventh house. So if there's any weight to you, you know what I'm saying? Attachment. Then you're going uphill after that. That's tough. Like going uphill is tough. So this Libra is where people get really stuck, super stuck. It's something I'm dealing with that stuff all the time, right? Like you get cozy and you're trying to like improve yourself, And it's easy to lapse back into that Libra consciousness of like trying to enjoy what you have. You have to keep going. And the work is so hard, right?
You have
So
to go enter the territory of Scorpio and start delving down within and digging through the shit to find that golden nugget and maybe bring it back out and throw it into the cauldron of Sagittarius and transform it into something different, so to speak.
Yeah, become something greater than what you've been, right? Transform. And that's scary. You know what I mean? Because transformation means that you're going to change. Things will be different. Transformation also implies that you could create something you might not like. And people are so afraid of that. It's a big deal. Like, you could make yourself into something different.
Right.
And you have to be kind of certain about where you're going and what you're doing and why you're doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if we spend all of our
you can
time...
become something, and
I was just going to say that if we spend all of our time and energy being afraid of our own shadow, then it's still there, and it's still going to mess with you. It's just that you're not dealing with it, right? And I forget who it was. I believe it was actually Grant Morrison. At one point, he's talking about the dark side and the idea of, like, to put it in Jung's terms, integrating the shadow or whatever. I know that you and I have both have sort of some conflicting ideas about Jung, and just the idea that he wasn't necessarily like a practitioner, but was maybe like sort of looking in from the outside or something in a way. But yeah, his idea of the integration of the shadow, those words at least get the point across. And I think that, and Grant Morrison, I believe it was in the Disinformation Conference, he brings up the point that, like, the hippie culture, basically, they were all like pure white light and they denied their shadow, and they just end up getting fucked by their shadow into too much of a good thing or whatever, and like trying to take this free love and free loving sort of world view and run with it. And it sounds lovely, sounds great to be able to just not think about any of the negative aspects of life, and maybe one day they'll all just go away and we'll have this utopian pre-fall Garden of Eden again or something like that, but like underneath some sort of utopian modern day sort of a nightmare version of that or something, maybe. What I was sort of getting at there is that I truly don't think that there's much to be gained by denying your own dark side, right? Like, I think that it's a lot more productive to acknowledge it and say, what are the aspects of myself that I don't particularly like, and to just have the strength to go down within and to look at yourself and then not only look and see what's down there, but say, okay, that's down there, and I'm either going to leave it and let it fester, or I'm going to just do something about it, and I'm going to bring it back up and put it in the cauldron and change it to something else and integrate it into everything.
I don't want to get too heavy into this because it's a very complicated subject, and you could do like hours just talking about it. But in the Western tradition of alchemy, the detritus, the ashes that are produced in the earlier phases of the work. So this is all the stuff that's supposed to be no good, right? It's literally just the crap. It's no good, the excrement. That, if it is discarded altogether, right, you will have nothing to contain and to materialize the gold, the alchemical gold produced at the end. And so when we leave all that stuff behind, we continue on this journey, when we come back, right, because we did the work and we burnt it down to its most essential element, right?
Mhm.
That means we have something that can be repurposed now as the material to contain and stabilize this thing we've produced, right? Like way later on in the process. Like this stuff
Oh,
has
that
just
makes
been left
perfect
behind.
sense. Yeah, that makes total
So
sense.
you
Definitely.
need to have a dark side that you're comfortable with and that you've taken inventory of and you understand and that you've worked on as best as you can. You've gotten rid of all the stuff that you could so that when you eventually have to take that and use it to just exist, it's stuff that will it's just the raw facts of having to be a manifest thing. There's going to be ugly stuff that comes with that, so we have to make it as ideal as possible. We have to make it as good as we can, and that when we do produce something of worth, we will have that as the consequence of it instead of all this other stuff that we could have gotten rid of, this vast like heap of trash essentially that we did not sort through. So it will come in handy in the future having done this. Because if you skip it over and you just do this other work, what happens is you have nowhere to put it, right? And what you're
Right.
actually doing is you're stuffing the gold, so to speak, into this deep cavern that someone is going to ultimately have to walk back through to get again. You're going to lose it. You know what I mean? You're going to actually, this is how those treasures, like the golden fleece and the Grail and all these different things get trapped in caves. This is why we have all these themes about dragons sitting on piles of gold in these really hard to get places. Someone has already made this mistake. That's the mythological story of having done the work without having confronted the shadow self or the underbelly of your soul. Like because you did not do that, now what has it become in your absence? Something so formidable, and you really didn't learn anything. You basically went through the whole cycle again, right? Right back up to Scorpio because you're down there again looking for this stuff. Right? So you can really just end up on this sort of merry-go-round, right? Doing that, refusing to confront this stuff, and this is why Scorpio deals with karma. It's the place where it all gets dumped, and you can keep on building it up every time you go around, right? It's not going to go anywhere because you're not dealing with it. You're not burning it off. You are not processing your attachment, right?
Right.
And I'm using word attachment in the most philosophical Eastern sense that I can. I know these are not terms that um, easily give themselves over to understanding sometimes, but I'm literally talking about the things that keep your soul from escaping when you die. That keep the things that draw you back into manifestation over and over again. That is attachment. That is those are your attachments, right? And when we don't burn them away, they get stored in this Scorpio place. And every time you're reborn, there is another. It didn't go anywhere. It's still there, collecting all of your garbage.
Right.
So you have to deal with it, right?
Yes.
So Sagittarius is how we go. Is how we do that process. It's the fire there that can purify it. It will burn away the impurities. So there is actually like a very interesting relationship between those two signs in that way. And there's also a very clear break between them. No nakshatras overlap that gap, right? There's a clear break there. So it's either pass or fail. You're
Oh,
either going to do
wow.
it or you're not.
That's interesting. Because
That's the
you,
same actually, yeah, for all of the water to fire transitions. It's a clear break for the Rashi and the nakshatra. There's no overlapping nakshatra there, ever.
that's really interesting
And
because it's just showing that it like solidifies that ending of the cycle again between
yeah,
water and fire that happens
it's
3 times throughout the permeation of the elements.
it's very final, right? So you can't really, there's no almost doing it, and there's no going back once you've done it. So, you know what I mean? If you're ever have to ask yourself whether or not you've been through this stuff, you haven't. It's
Hmm.
as simple as that. So what's next? Capricorn, right? Capricorn is the third and final earth sign. We're talking about solidification and manifestation on a level that we have not yet seen, right? And Capricorn is, in my opinion, although widely understood, there are aspects of it that are not very frequently discussed and brought into the limelight, which I think are really important. And so that detritus I'm talking about earlier, right? That stuff that won't go away even after you burn everything down to its barest essentials. That is the clay of Capricorn. Capricorn deals with mountainous, barren landscapes. That's the image that's usually given for Capricorn. It's like this mountainous, barren landscape. And that is why the goat is the symbol of Capricorn, is because it's what can navigate that area, right? This barren place where nothing else can exist. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the actual manifestation of the work as a lived, real thing. So we created this etheric body. We did all this spiritual internal work, right? But we're not dead. We didn't leave the world. So now we're bringing it down into actual manifestation. We're doing something with it now. It's going to be put into action, right? And so that's this material Capricorn stuff going on, right? Capricorn deals with reputation, government, status, career, profession. So it's very dharmic in that way. It's like purpose. So now that you've done all this, something has to be put towards something now. It has to have been about something the whole time, right? So this is where we implement now. You have a new range of motion. That's what a body provides, right? So Aries provided you a range of motion, right? Body that you use to navigate these first few sort of chapters of your life, right? You had this soul, this raw creative power. It was given like a form to inhabit in Taurus, and you progressed, right? Fire and the earth come together to create this sort of vehicle to traverse the zodiac. And now we do it again in Leo, right? And Virgo. We create something to deal with obstacles, an identity, right? Something strong, like an ego that can actually bang up against stuff and get somewhere, right? Problem solve, navigate. And then we do it again here, only now it's very abstract. It's become spiritual work. And we're actually producing something now to traverse the world in a much bigger way. Because Capricorn, we're getting really far out now, right? Like this is ruled by Saturn, Capricorn. We're dealing with like actually interacting with the big picture now. Our influence on society, on others that we've never even encountered before. We're talking about really far-reaching karmic consequences because Capricorn is a planet that deals with the public and with the lower classes. It deals with the masses. And so when we're talking about Capricorn, we're talking about the karmic baggage or the karmic actually, it's more like the range of motion that you have now is so vast that the karmic influences that you have are vast. You're dealing with the public now. This is how you influence people that you do not know, right? This is super abstract at this point in a way, while also being quite material, because in the sense that it is sort of the manifest consequences of your higher actions now, right? You created this new person that you are, and you've engaged in this new path, this sort of self-aware dharma, right? This purpose that will have consequences. And those consequences, these operations you're undertaking, will affect people in very manifest, felt, even material ways that you've never met and may never meet, right? It has far-reaching consequences. So we're dealing now with the actual material consequences of what we've done, and as Capricorn, and it's all wrapped up in that. Like there's this whole story of acting now and exerting yourself on the world in this way. So yeah, it's very intense, right? And there's no safety here. This is the complete opposite of Cancer. It's the opposite sign. It's 7 houses away. So there's no security. There's no one's here to save you or to help you. There's no one who can tell you what to do, right? It's up to you now. You have to make decisions. You have to exert your will, right? And there's a bigger test coming. That's the other thing. Aquarius is even more intense in that way, because this is just your ability, right? Your ability to do this stuff. This is like your design being implemented. It's the raw physical facts of it, but there's more on the way. And so Capricorn deals so much with just this, like, the raw action of being an initiated person and the responsibility that comes with. And that's why it represents the father in the chart. 10th house as well. The 10th sign, 10th house. Right? So it's the father as opposed to the mother, which is the 4th house, seven houses away. So the father. So responsibility, right? The father has to produce, in a traditional framework, has to produce and provide and protect. He's not being protected or provided for or produced for, right? Like, he has to do this and create all this stuff and maintain it, and it's up to him, right? At the end of the day. So Capricorn really deals with this stuff. And it's intense in that way, right? It's also, interestingly, where Mars is exalted, because this is where Mars, which is about action and striving and ambition and like doing, right? This is where it's exalted, and it's actually so powerful there, because that's all Capricorn's about, is just actual raw, like, consequences of doing and being and your responsibilities, and it deals with government for that reason. Capricorn is deeply tied to government, nations, to any large social structure. Special emphasis here on structure too. It's not so much the interactions. That's kind of an Aquarius thing. It's the actual raw structure of society, and the raw hierarchy and the overarching design of society, right? The form that it takes. And and so Mars is all about that, constructing and forming and doing and making, right? And so in the chart, by one of the things you'll see is that Capricorn can deal with people not finding their purpose, right? Struggling with purpose. It can deal with almost an inability to form a body for this higher self they've constructed, right? So people who have a vision.
So again, what you were saying about the leftovers being used as the vessel, or
yeah, I mean, sometimes they're not that great, right? And even if you did a good job, this is just one of your many lives. Like, you might have a lot more to work out that you just can't do right now, but this is the best you've got. You might find it hard to pull yourself down into a body, in a Capricorn body that can actually do this stuff, right? And realize your purpose. So you can see afflictions of the career, of the overarching, like, work life of a person. So their jobs and kind of things they end up doing for a living, and their reputation and their status and all this stuff, right? Things they're known for, and how they're recognized in that way. So yeah, like, in a lot of ways, Capricorn is very stark and simple. Like, it's not something where it's super hard to figure out what's going on there in a chart. Like, the earth signs are pretty, like, they just kind of scream out at you, I'm doing this. They're very rigid, and they're earth, like, they're rocky, and especially Capricorn. This is not like the fields and the plains of Virgo, or the lush forests and almost like muddy, like, more like, Taurus is not as hard to influence. It's a little mushier, right? But Capricorn's just raw stone. It's mountains, immovable. It's so sturdy and like, it's not going anywhere.
So
It's like a goat. It's stubborn.
it almost seems like in this last permeation of the elements, that all of the elemental signs like Sagittarius and now Capricorn, maybe they're moving into a more true version to their nature, right? That, like, if they're evolving and this is the final sort of step of the process, then the water signs in the final, in that final phase, are more watery, and the fiery signs are more fiery. So Capricorn, being the earth sign, would be the most earthy, or the most solidified. It's ruled by Saturn. Saturn is transformative, but it also has this rulership over the planet Earth. Like, it's a restricting force in that way.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, and this is actually what creates all the impassable, almost impossible things to overcome in the world. You know, when they said talk about moving mountains, that's what they're talking about, Capricorn stuff. You can't just fight Capricorn. It's very unyielding. And so issues of Capricorn are unyielding. They can be overcome, but there's so much strength there. And Capricorn people are kind of like that too, right? Like, but it's a very stubborn, intense thing. And this is like the raw facts of geology almost, in a way, or there's just stuff in society and in the world around you that you individually are not going to overcome, right? That you need to work with a lot of other people to influence and to affect. And the Saturn Rashis deal with stuff that can really only be tackled in very large groups. Like Capricorn issues are civilizational, or large, and they require vast amount of teamwork. It's like terraforming. You can't do that on your own. You need machinery and engineering. That's something to come together to figure out and put the raw labor into it. You can't just, flatten a mountain, right? It can be done, but with all these people together, right? So it's really it deals a lot with like all the stuff you have to do in groups and stuff that has to be tackled with a great deal of organization, and authority has to be really prevalent there. You need a lot of people who are going to take orders and do what they're told, or you're not going to build anything. You're not going to change anything. And so, you know what I mean? It's like it doesn't fool around. There's no talking your way in and out of this, right? It's not like Virgo where there's Mercury involved, right? You could almost like talk your way out of a problem. You can make a friend out of an enemy, You can't really argue with Capricorn issues. They require action, and they require organization, and they require submission to authority, right?
Yeah, like Virgo is the mutable earth sign, right? Whereas
way more.
Whereas Capricorn is the fixed earth sign, so that makes total sense. Versus Taurus being the cardinal earth sign, or so we can sort of see Taurus as being the most earthly in that it's the bull, and it's like, but Capricorn, as you've been discussing, is sort of represents this more so of the low point in the cycle, or this bringing everything back down after you've built it up and you've created this entire, or expanded on all the more subtle aspects of the self throughout this entire alchemical process that has been the zodiacal year thus far, and now we've come to the point where it's time to bring it all back down to earth.
Correct. And this is where, the pedal meets the metal, This is where you're going to find out whether or not you got it right. And you're not going to know
rubber
right
to the
now.
asphalt it's the laying of rubber to the asphalt in the process kind of thing. It's where it starts to happen in the material world, you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, because like, it's like entrance into true adulthood, as is often discussed, or entrepreneurship. you can't really be an entrepreneur if you're working for somebody else, right?
Right.
You kind of have to just take a chance, and you don't really know if it's going to work until you do it. And this is really the same thing. This preparation that we undergo our whole lives, we don't even know we're doing it. There's a point where you're going to find out if you've actually succeeded in making something that will survive that will succeed, that will do its job. That's Capricorn. It's a real test. It's not, it doesn't, there's no question about whether or not you've succeeded when you get there, because you will know, because you will fail or you will succeed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's either you're broken on the rocks or you're climbing, you're getting somewhere, right?
Right. So in that way,
Either
it's this sort of point of testing the process up until now, right? We're always sort of at this point of Capricorn in that way, where there's always been a process which has brought us up to this point. And it's sort of like saying, where are we in actuality? Like if we put it to the test, would the vessel break right now?
Yeah. And then now we get into the final air sign, Aquarius, the second Saturn Rashi. So now Saturn's Aries again. Now, if you remember the other two air signs, they're social. They deal with interaction, right? The sort of actual communication and reconnecting and softening of the edges that occurred in the Earth sign. So we had a world made, and now it's going to start living and interacting and tying itself together and like harmonizing, right? And so Aquarius is the experience of civilization. It's actually going out there. It's like strangers and acquaintances and people you kind of don't really know, but you know they're there. It's like when you picture a large group of people, like a bunch of strangers or a crowd, you are thinking in Aquarius terms, right? That's the masses, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of them being intellectual and like conscious beings. Like this is the actual like experiential and communicative aspect of it, the social aspect of civilization, of societies. So it's like Aquarius is like the urban environment in its most extreme sense or form. That's what you produces, the metropolis, this massive sea of strangers, all interacting and communicating, but almost in secret too. Like no one really knows everybody. No one really has a profound connection with anyone. You just kind of almost know everyone in a weird way. You have expectations, you have culture, right? A personality that everyone shares, you know, this sort of ambient self that has all these permeations as individuals in a large, extremely large group. Aquarius can even be considered in global terms. And I can't wait to talk about the nakshatra aspect of this when we get into that, because it is fascinating. It really, really is. And there's a portion in Aquarius where there's total freedom. Total freedom. It's anonymous. It's when you're completely anonymous in the crowd, so to speak. Total freedom. No authority. Nothing to tell you what to do. No expectations. No judgment. That's the big thing. No judgment. No consequences. Do whatever you want, right? Anything is possible. But, and this is so important, there will be a point where that will end and you will reap your rewards. This is like a huge transformational thing here, because you're approaching the end now. This is the 11th hour, quite literally. It's the 11th sign, right? That's a great way to look at it. It's the 11th hour, because you can do whatever you want in Aquarius. There's so much freedom, but that party does end, and you will be stuck with whatever you decided to do with that freedom, right? That freedom is actually a transformative process. It is an opportunity to really stretch your legs that you built. You know what I mean? In Sagittarius and Capricorn, you can really do anything now, right? You've accomplished so much, and you've gotten your head around this new body you've made. Now you get to play with it. This is the largest temptation that you will ever face in your life. This is where you can be led into total damnation, total and utter, despicable, horrible. Like, you can reach lows here that are not possible elsewhere. The greatest depravities that can be undertaken take place in Aquarius.
So this is sort of the point where it's decided when the time of Pisces comes, whether you're going to sink or swim, so to speak.
Oh yeah, big time. Because this almost really pertains to the flood in the Bible. I don't like relying so much on biblical mythology, but just having grown up with it, like, I find it very easy in these examples to just throw it out there. And because everyone's familiar with it, unfortunately, But basically, Sodom and Gomorrah is the best way to understand a failed Aquarius consciousness. So what's happening is there's total freedom and lack of judgment. And no one's saying, do this, don't do that, whatever. There's no authority. And what happens is if people make the wrong decision, if they decide to become something monstrous, then the consequences are monstrous. And Sodom and Gomorrah is why in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew tradition, God calls upon a great flood. And so what comes after Aquarius is Pisces, the water sign. So you have this great flood on the way, right? And these people, if we're going to continue this metaphor, are not building an ark. You know what I mean? They have not learned, and they have been given this great temptation of freedom and power and influence and ability. And what happens when you abuse that is the punishment is so much more severe than it ever has been before. Because how we talked about all that shit, the sewer down in Scorpio? This is almost like what happens if you start putting shit down in there again with this new life that you've created, this new body. So now you have more karma than you've ever had before, more karmic influence you've ever had before. So you can accrue a lot more negative karma, a lot more poor, a lot more stains on your soul at that level, right? The temptation of power is so much greater in Aquarius because you have so much power there. So when you fuck that up, you are stacking that sewer right up, like you're just filling it with the worst stuff possible because you're so much more capable of producing things that are amazing or horrible. There's the polarity here is so extreme. You can make something abominable or celestial, heavenly, entirely benign, benefic. You can save the world with this kind of power. You know what I'm talking about? And so what happens here is when this is squandered, it just unleashes the most unbelievably horrible consequence. Total annihilation, right?
Right.
Like that's what this flood that comes in Pisces is. This is Sodom and Gomorrah being washed away. You know what I mean? This is the great flood in the mythologies of all the world.
Right, and it would have to take a particularly strange karma to bring you to that place that if you find yourself in a place where you per se have inherited a lot from the gods, so to speak, or you've been given a lot, but then you don't embrace it, right? Like what would lead a person to have this karma that brings them to that place, but then to be unable to recognize it and embrace that and apply it in their life?
Well, because here's the thing, every time you incarnate in a better situation, the likelihood that you will remain spiritually oriented and upward looking, right? And metaphysically speaking, aspiring, right? Like you're aspirant, you're thinking about your spirit and your soul, and you're trying to relieve yourself of attachment, of negativity, right? When you're given more and more temptation every time, right? What that means is the test gets harder and harder as you go, right? And there's a point where people just some temptations are just too great for people, and they had to kind of do that a couple times to get it, right? And so right now, interestingly enough, we live in this time where everybody is so, well, I should say that's not true. There's an elite in our world, right? There are people with more than anyone could possibly imagine, all this money and influence and power and freedom. They have an immense amount of freedom. The people in our world that have the power to buy their way out of any problem, to hide anything that might bring them shame or some kind of justice, they can move freely through the world. They can do whatever they want, and there's no consequences, right? That is Aquarius. That is the experience of Aquarius. We're looking at it right now. All these people who can just do whatever they please. But here's the thing. There is a consequence for that. And the fact that we have all these billionaires and stuff who are abusing their gifts and their power and their authority and effectively destroying the world, there is a consequence to that. And it is unavoidable. There is a flood coming. You know what I mean? That's how you have to see this. There is a flood. There is something will actually come about because of that. And you don't want to get caught up in that. You know what I mean? You don't want to be the person who abused that much power because the consequences are so great. And this is probably as good as a you know what? We should probably talk a little bit about what it does in the chart instead of hopping right over to Pisces. So in the chart, Aquarius can be used to kind of get a feel for the temptations we're given, the opportunities we're given, and it's the house of gains. The 11th house is the house of gains. It's like where you win the lottery. It's the big gifts you didn't do anything for, right? They're just rewards. It's a measure of the opportunities that you get in life, the people that you will know that are influential. It's like the value of your social network being measured in Aquarius.
Okay, so Libra was also associated with the tribe and social network and things like that, right? Like, so is there a bit
all
of a
the air signs are social. All the air signs are social. So that's really what Aquarius deals with, right? So, and same with the 11th house, 11th sign, right? So 11th house, those issues are present there. And Aquarius is also deeply connected to technology. I should mention that. Technology, especially digital media, modern media, the internet is a profoundly Aquarius thing because you can be anonymous on the internet. And totally free. Say whatever you want, do whatever you want. And nothing happens because of it. You know what I mean? And Aquarius deals with the horrors of technology, all the things that it does that are negative, all the consequences of technological development are also present there, as well as the benefits, everything that comes with that. With the present state of modernity that we're in, this highly technologically advanced and decadent the state that we're in, that is Aquarius in a lot of ways. Then you see the next phase is Pisces.
Can we just pause there for 1 second? I was just finding it interesting that you were talking about Aquarius having this aspect of total unbound freedom. But Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. which is the planet of oppression, essentially, or
Yeah.
restriction and control. So again, we're at a point of this sort of an automatic invocation of its opposite or something, right?
Yes, and there are other factors involved there. Once again, we need to get into the nakshatras to get into why Aquarius is like this. But the other reason is that Saturn um, has a nature to it that's kind of interesting because Saturn is submission and Saturn is oppression and limitation, but it's also the excruciating desire to transcend all those things. And so,
Right. So it has its opportunity in Aquarius in that way, you're saying.
yeah. So
Do
this
you
is
see?
almost like Saturn's flip out in a way. It's the rebellion, but rebellion is this thing that can go two ways, right? Rebellion can be positive and it can be negative. And so Saturn doesn't like the situation we're in right now is a choice. You have to understand that. All these people that are choosing to do the wrong thing with their power and influence, it is a choice. You can decide to do the right thing with this. This could have gone a different way. And so in that sense, Saturn represents the revolution itself, not the product. So you can have a revolution for the wrong reasons, and you can try to achieve the wrong ends. And you can just have a revolution, You can just have a revolution just so you can feel the
Right.
thrill.
It's a tantrum. It's a
Yeah.
lot like it's the energy behind the tantrum, but it's not the results of said
No. So
flashing
you can,
out or whatever.
yeah, you can have a productive upset like this,
Hmm.
and you can have an unproductive one.
It's
So
like the reaching of a point just where restrictions and obstacles just have to be broken, not necessarily for a good or bad reason, but it's just they're being broken.
Yeah, because this is the dissolution of all these borders that have been erected in Capricorn. There's a dissolving happening, an evaporating. It's air, right? There's an evaporation, and a smokiness, and like it's very dissolving, right? In fact, Aquarius is considered to be ruled by Shiva, and especially in his Mahapralaya aspect as a destroyer and a dissolver. And so this is a preparation for transcendence, right?
Nothing can be created without destruction.
Yeah, correct.
The very
So,
process of creation is very much the same, in that something has been destroyed. There's been something brought in to whatever is newly created.
yeah. And so this is the next and final phase, right? Like, is Pisces. Pisces is transcendence, ego death, loss. It deals with incarceration, and it deals with being trapped, deals with secrets and dreams, intuitions, the subconscious, all this stuff. And it has a very dual nature because of that, in a way, because it deals with like total transcendence and escape and total entrapment, damnation. Oh, sorry, damnation and liberation, right?
Right.
Enlightenment. So this is the consequence, right? Now it's not eternal. This is not a Christian framework. This is not a messianic slash Abrahamic conception of the world. This Jyotish, right? So we're not going to say that the consequences that, although quite grand and immense, are not final. They
Right.
are.
It's just because something is the end point of the cycle, it's still a cycle. It begins again.
Yes. Now you're going to inherit your mistakes, right? But this is essentially the judgment that's going to be experienced. This is judgment. So ruled by Jupiter, the great guru, the teacher, right? And he's come back and he's like, did you learn your lesson, right? And if you did not, there are grave consequences. This is where we see Pisces association with hospitals, prisons, insane asylums, all these sort of places where you end up when you fail
Right.
some way or something fails, right? They and it's I associate it with hell, with the lower spheres and lokas, so to speak, the lower realms in the afterlife, where your soul goes through immense. You created something. In Aquarius, if you create something monstrous of yourself, all that freedom, then you will have to live out the pain of being a monster. That is the punishment. And when the light is cast upon you and you actually, that's all you ended up being, was just this horrific thing, you will collapse in on yourself and become a prison in your own body, in your own thing you made, right? It's and this is actually interesting, is Pisces associated with the bed, and we're all familiar with the turn of phrase, make your bed and sleep in it, or you made your bed, now sleep in it, right? Any variation on that. This is what it's about. Like, you made your bed. This whole now is you making your bed, right? And now you are going to sleep in it. And what's that going to be like for you, right? This is the end of your life. This deals with death. Not by accident or anything like that, by old age. This is the end. That's what Pisces deals with. And the transcendence of everything you've created and you've done. And the ultimate reaping consequences.
Odin, quiet.
And once again, you nakshatra video. The nakshatra video that we're going to do is really going to get into the process, like the nakshatras that explicitly deal with death in this way. What is experienced here is a reaping of consequence and a transition into finality and a close to the story. And this is when you're reborn, right?
Right. I was actually
between Pisces and Aries, and you come around.
I was actually just sort of picking up on that as you were saying it, and I was going to mention that I just wrote myself a little note to remember to mention it. We've now just gone through 2 Saturn-ruled zodiac signs into a sign that's ruled by Jupiter. So it's almost like Saturn has rulership over these last 2 signs. It's like this final trial that he's giving before you get to Jupiter, and then it's the judgment. And you're either, as we were saying earlier, you're either going to sink or swim. You're either going to die, and that's the end of the process, or you're going to be reborn in Aries. Is that sort of what you're getting
at?
If
you die, because and death here, of course, is can be 2 things. It can be transcendence or it can be damnation, right? And then there's reincarnation. So you have these 3 options. You can happen in a lower sphere of existence beneath the material world or above it, right? So there's an opportunity here to get out, right? Or to get trapped in a much more primitive or even proto-primitive, like really like not good place, like
so in a way, this is almost like talking about samsara and the breaking of the cycles of rebirth, and either escaping or not. You're either coming back or you're not.
Yeah. And there's like, it's not just coming back or not, because you don't have anything better. It can be worse, and it can be so much worse that it's not even this reality anymore. It's one of these hell realms beneath it. Like that's a real thing. It's a real place you're gonna have to work your way up out of if you end up there.
Right, in Tibetan Buddhism, Sorry, Odin and Shiva woke up from their nap and they're starting to get so feisty here behind me. I've been trying to shut them up, like without being too loud in shutting them up. But sorry, boys. Um, what were we just talking about?
So we're just getting into that there are these sort of infernal worlds
Right. Yeah,
you can descend into, right?
I was about to say that in the Tibetan Buddhist system, the bardo or the word bardo, people tend to associate it with the period of time that you endure between this life and the next life, or but from my understanding, the term bardo actually just implies a transition or a period of both, or I don't want to say stagnation, a period of rest, or but also change between two periods. So it's almost saying that you when you mentioned hell, I pictured this sort of internally negative bardo, the idea of dying and just going off into an obscure hell that you've created for your own spirit in a way.
And that's what happens, right? And you can create a good, there's heavens above you can ascend into. You might not, there's transcendence of like the earth plane or the middle world, right? The Midgard, so to speak. And then there's levels above that. You might not get all the way to the top, like you know, but you can get out of, you can get like a little bit up.
Right.
You can ascend, right? But falling from greater heights is more painful too, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that can happen on this journey. You can go up and down quite a bit, like, you know, and the climb up is really hard, right? But the reward, like the feeling of reward is really like encouraging. So there's all kinds of things that can happen, right?
That brings to mind an interesting image to me, which is the image in the Norse system of the squirrel that travels up and down the tree of life to communicate with the eagle at the top and the serpent below the ground. And in that, you're saying that it's more difficult to climb upwards than it is to go downwards, right? And so in that way, it brought to mind the idea that it's always more difficult to take the virtuous path than the path of vice, right? It's always more difficult to move upwards than to go downward. It's a lot more, or it's a lot easier, say in our communication, to descend into gossip than it is to maintain a sort of more respectful way of communicating and things like that. I just wanted to say that before.
Of course. Yeah, and once again, like there's so much stuff we touched on this whole time that is gonna just get like super expanded upon in the nakshatra stuff. So in fact, what I would like to do in the future, I guess I'm just gonna propose this on the air, but like I think this is a way to tackle it, is because the nakshatras are so dense, the thing to do I think would be to take them in sections of 9. So we'll have all the nakshatras that extend across Aries and Cancer, which is a full cycle, as an episode. And then you do it again with Leo through Scorpio and then Sagittarius through Pisces because they're so dense.
Right. So
the nakshatras will make the zodiac seem so simple and sparse and stark by comparison because they're so dense. Mythologically, symbolically, everything.
Right. I have an idea then, because I guess this would be a good time to talk about the fact that we've been discussing doing the episode of the Nakshatra as the third installment and having it air or broadcasting it on Samhain this year. And so maybe we could just do that as kind of a more introductory video on the topic of the nakshatras. And then after that, we can really dig into it, and we'll break it up into the 3 sets of 9 nakshatras, and you can really get into them. But I think maybe perhaps for the for the episode, or the third installment, when we do get into the nakshatras. Yeah, for that reason, that maybe it would be good to talk maybe more just sort of openly about the nakshatras and talk about the also in this episode we did touch a lot upon the houses and what those imply with the Rashis and the zodiacal signs, but maybe it would be we can have a little part there where we also just talk a little more about how the role of the different houses change in someone's chart, and how the houses move around, or the rulership of the houses changes according to the person's ascendant sign. So you'll have different zodiacal signs or different Rashis appearing within the different houses. And we just did, I feel like we've talked a lot today, and to bring that up, it may not, do you want to discuss that now before we move on?
No, the houses,
It seems like something that we could take a whole episode just to discuss.
you could, like, we've touched on it a bit here and there, and like we technically have covered a lot of the essence
Okay.
of houses, but like getting into the technical like use of, and like how they're plays into the actual reading of the chart and everything, that really does require a lot of time, or at least it deserves a lot of time. One thing I would like to do though before we wrap up is about Pisces, is the 12th house in the chart, right, deals with, like the other water signs, secrets. And these are the deepest, darkest secrets you've got. This is the deep subconscious. This is the part of you might not have ever experienced. Dreams can come from here. It deals with loss, and it deals with imprisonment. The most dire consequences for your actions are indicated in the 12th house. So if you want to know what the worst things that can happen to you if you fuck up, that's where you look. And it deals with hospital stays and madness and a lot of stuff that happens when you go astray. And then it also deals with spirituality, transcendence, devotion, anything that's really religious and really heavily deals with like overcoming the self and overcoming attachment and finding your finding God with the gods, uniting with Godhead, anything that's truly overpoweringly auspicious occurs in Pisces. So it's a very like here or there sign. There's a lot of middle ground there, but I'm just saying like the breadth of it is so wide. Like it deals with stuff that seems so unrelated almost, these vast polar opposites at the end of these very wide expanses, in terms of like symbolic content, everything. Like the difference between being trapped in a hospital bed, crippled, versus transcending the known universe. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, I do know what you're saying.
Yeah.
And because it's like we've reached the end, so the separation is more dramatic. The consequences of said separation are more dire than they were earlier in the process, right? Because this is now, it's the end point. Like it's all happening now. There was still room for change in the past. Like if that vessel like potentially needed to be strengthened or something, maybe you can go back and do something else in the process, so that at this point it wouldn't be such a sink or swim kind of thing. But you're saying that it's now reached the point where it is sink or swim. You've reached the judgment. You've been imprisoned. You had your little lash out tantrum in Aquarius, so to speak, and now the dust is settled and you've been punished and you're put in the corner. It's like, okay, am I going to learn my lesson, or am I going to do the same thing again and have to get put back in the corner or whatever? It's even beyond that point where it's like you're not going to get the opportunity to make the mistake again because it's done.
This is
or
it.
whatever, right? And that brings to mind the fact that, or you were talking about separation and attachment, and the fifth klesha within yoga, or the final obstruction. The first obstruction is ignorance. The second is ego, and then you move into repulsion, and anyway, the fifth klesha, being attachment to life, is or clinging to life, I meant to say, is the most dire, right? Like we've reached the end of the process, and all of those things that through life, or we've now reached a point where there very much are things that are still holding us down and holding us back to this world. And the more that we've been prepared to free ourselves of those and just cut those ties in the end, then, and be reborn in Aries, so to speak.
It's interesting too. The most we talked about the immense potential for achieving forms, and whether angelic or demonic, in Aquarius, and their kind of solidification, or like the confrontation with what you've created in Pisces. That's so final. There is this thing that I kind of want to touch on there, is that you'll notice a theme in a lot of stories is the horrendous things that are produced by the desire for immortality. And we think of the vampire, the Dracula, the Dracul, this thing that is so attached to life, refuses to let go of it, that it becomes horrific. It becomes unlife, undead. It is so just unsubstantiated by itself at this point. Everything is rotten away. It's only just the remnants of everything that it can cling to. You know what I mean?
I'm
Just
hearing a really negative aspect of K2, basically, in a way.
yeah. And other things that are in there. There's the when. Well, I'll give you a little teaser. There's not chakras that we're going to get into. The Aquarius and Pisces, the nakshatras there, you're going through Rahu, and then you're moving into Jupiter, Saturn, and then Mercury. So Rahu, Jupiter, and Saturn, like, that can be intense stuff. Like, Rahu is insatiable and hungry and ravenous and arrogant and expansive, and it just wants to expand and never stop. And Jupiter can get like that too. So you kind of have these two opportunities there between Rahu and Jupiter to just engorge yourself. And when you hit this Pisces stage, this engorging that takes place, that's, you know what I mean? Like, when you are facing death and you want to outrun it, and that's the only thing you know to do or think to do, I'll just keep on consuming until I can't anymore, and then maybe I can cheat death. You won't. It'll just be this long, agonizing, horrific descent into the lowest pits of the infernal realms, but on Earth as a living thing. And so immortality is this horrible curse in that sense, in that the physical immortality, and all
Or
these
it's temptation.
yeah, but all this transhumanism stuff I strongly associate with a failed Pisces confrontation. All this stuff about, like, putting ourselves in the bodies of mechanical bodies, all this physical immortality, that is vampirism. It is empty, hollowed out undeath, and it will be a horrific thing to undergo. And no one will be thankful that they decided to do that, if it ever becomes a reality. It's in the theme, even just in fiction, that's what it is to me. In the context of understanding it as like this Aquarius Pisces thing, right? But yeah, it's intense stuff. Like, it's a really fucked up part of everyone's life right now, because we live in an age of such immense temptation and delusion that it's very hard to approach that stuff in a way that's going to be healthy and productive. There's a lot of danger there. And, we really need to try and find a guiding light in our lives so that we can deal with that.
Yeah, you've really brought to mind a kind of powerful idea here to me, and it is just still in the same topic of the initiator or the guru and the spirit of Jupiter, and it's a kind of an interesting or powerful idea that that came to my mind. And the idea that in this way that Jupiter is not only the guru and the teacher, but the judge at the same time. And so it brought to mind.
Jupiter is associated with judges. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it brought to mind the idea that of the weighing of the heart, almost of in Egypt, right? When you die and they put your heart on the scale to see how much it weighs in comparison to a feather, and if your heart is too heavy, then they're going to feed it to Sebek, the crocodile. So on one side of the scales you have Sebek, the crocodile, who's waiting there for the ones who aren't going to make it, to consume whatever the hell is left and send it back to the chaos. But then in front of the scales, you have Thoth, the teacher and the initiator, who is there witnessing the weighing of the heart. And it's like, so you've reached this point. Up until this point, what you've taken from the teacher, and it can all be sort of manipulated or whatever. But you've reached this point where it's like, oh no, the teacher and the judge are the same person. I can't lie to the judge because he's been teaching me the whole time. And now it's this moment of truth where it's like there's no turning back. It's like, what is your heart at this moment that you died? Are you going to carry on and be taken up by the gods, or have you done something worthwhile that we see fit for admitting you into our halls, or are we going to feed you to the fish right now?
Yeah. And once again, a little teaser, the last three nakshatras are Purva Bhadrapada, Uttara Bhadrapada, and Revati.
Ouch.
So Purva Bhadrapada is the two-faced man. Yeah, Jupiter, the judge, the weighing, right? And then you have two options. Saturn is the ruler of Uttara Bhadrapada. This is your Sebek, your crocodile, your devourer, right? Mm-hmm. Or punisher. And then you have Revati, which is Mercury, Thoth, the one who can actually allow you to, take you to the next level, carry you to the next world. Mercury can traverse the worlds. Mm-hmm. So this is the thing, right? Like, it's up to you. Like, you set yourself up for this at the end of the day. No, Saturn does not get to touch you unless you hand yourself over to him.
Yeah.
Saturn, yeah, and Saturn's purpose, even at this point, is still to teach you through his oppression and to educate you through pain so that you will not do this again, because he loves you. Same thing with Mercury. They love you. Like, you know what I mean? There is real love that comes from these entities, even when they seem frightening, because what they are there to do is to help you. And Saturn doesn't know how to teach or to love in any other way, right? So that's how he operates.
It's interesting.
And Mercury, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that Jupiter being associated with this authority figure almost, or something, or being associated with the king, and I picture the idea of Jupiter representing the king's power on the throne or something, or the power of God in the material world, and this holding of the responsibility of teaching and passing on the wisdom of God when you do hold it. And so you said that Jupiter is associated with the judge and things like that. It's interesting because, like, in court, the judge is wearing the uniform of an ancient priest of Saturn, I believe, right? Like the white wig and the black cloak is the ancient uniform of or it's depicting Saturn.
And this is the thing, is that the last two nakshatras that are ruled by Jupiter and Saturn are in the opposite signs. So, like, Purva Bhadrapada is mostly in Aquarius, ruled by Saturn. And then Uttara Bhadrapada is entirely in Pisces, ruled by Jupiter, right? So they're both like Saturn and Jupiter, with one of them being stronger than the other in each case.
Right. It seems that those two planets have a relationship that is implied in their glyphs as well.
Oh yeah.
That Jupiter is an inversion of the ancient glyph of Saturn.
Yeah,
and they appear on either side of the abyss on the tree of life of Kabbalah when you follow the lightning flash down from the top sphere. And then as it crosses the abyss, it goes from Saturn to Jupiter. Saturn represents this oppressive, restrictive force or controlling aspect, whereas Jupiter represents this expansive and wanting to grow aspect. So they have this interplay very much.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. And like their relationship is very profound. Like you could talk about just those two planets all day. All day. You can do that with anything in this. Like this is one of those subjects where you could hone in on any one thing here and expand on it over and over and over. Like keep on picking out smaller and smaller parts and expanding it. Like it's just insane how much you can dig into with this stuff. Like we can just do these episodes forever and we'd never run out of things.
No, it's true. I think we've broken the 3-hour mark at this point.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close. I think we've at least been doing this for like 2.5. But yeah, so I propose we wrap it up, because this is just going to explode again the moment we forget that we're trying to wrap it up. Like,
yeah. Okay, so on that note, yeah, is there anything final that you want to say about Pisces, or final that you want to say about the whole process, just to wrap things up before we just do a quick closing?
Yeah, only thing I would like to say, I guess, is that when you look at your chart and you try to understand it as a description of your entire life, there's often a tendency to view it as like, just like people are kind of concerned about little things like, oh, am I going to have a nice house? Am I going to have a good job? Am I going to blah, 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 blah. Like, just trying to think of it, as I was talking about earlier, like you're only thinking as far as maybe Libra. You know what I mean? You're not really going that far. Like, this is not about whether or not you're going to be able to afford a jacuzzi. Like, you know what I mean? And if that's what you're looking for. Yeah, that's what you're looking for.
Thinking about the higher aspects of existence, right? It just shows that when people are getting stuck there, that's the place that they are stuck, that they're not ready to move on to the deeper facets of their being.
Yeah, and what I find ends up happening is that, like it's just this thing where the real purpose of this is not really hitting home for people, right? And it needs to be understood. The reason why this science exists is it's a tool for you to understand how to enrich your spirit and overcome your karmas and the things that are holding you down, holding you back, and the things that are preventing you from transcending your present condition of manifestation and attachment and material involvement, right? That's preventing your spirit from moving on to the next step when you die, right? Like, people kind of think of your death as the end of the journey. That's not the case. This is all about getting ready for the next step every single time. This life is a preparation, right? And you can fail that. That's a real thing that can happen. you don't just fuck up at the end. You're like, oh well, it doesn't matter because I don't have to do anything anymore, you know. And I guess I wish I had more fun or something. That's not the case. That's just the beginning. Like, it doesn't end with that. And there's an immense responsibility that comes with understanding you are immortal, that you're not going to just go away when this is over, and you're going to keep having to deal with this stuff. It's not a freeing thing. It shouldn't be to think that in a way. Like, there's no, you're not being told that there are no consequences, or that there's no, you know what I'm saying? Like, you just don't want to go through life thinking that you're only going to do this once and that's it, because that is the easiest way to screw it up.
No, exactly.
Right?
And I've
The easiest way
found,
to screw it up.
and I was just going to say that that's another thing that I find that monotheism has kind of created a problematic way of thinking in the modern day, is that people spend their life thinking that this is it and there's nothing beyond this, and so live it up while you can and just embrace like immediate kind of pleasure, and don't look into sort of the deeper aspects of your being and what you were. We have a tendency to for some reason even like take life for granted, because in that way, and that we think that there's nothing beyond it, because it's like, oh well, it's all this nihilistic kind of idea of if there's nothing after life, then it's all meaningless, and then you don't even embrace the life that you have while you're here, let alone prepare yourself for anything beyond it, right? So the black dharmas strike again.
Yeah, it's just this Rick and Morty consciousness we end up adopting or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
I am too much of a cave person to understand what you're talking about. I know of these characters, Rick and Morty, but I don't know enough about them.
I'm just saying, like, this show is just as abhorrently nihilistic propaganda.
All I know is that they have a portal gun, man. They have a gun that makes
And
portals.
you know where it leads? You know where it leads? Samsara. There you go. Turn off the cartoons. Yeah.
I wouldn't want a gun that made a portal to that.
You know. So yeah. That's so yeah. There you go. That's the mysteries of the Rashis. You know, at least we got everyone kind of like, thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that we covered some really great territory there, and that we really touched on a lot of really important and powerful aspects of the Rashis and how they play into the whole system of Jyotish. And yeah, I think that as we go on, it's just going to keep getting better. And so I guess, do you want to just wrap it up there, and I'll quickly talk about what we're going to get up to on Samhain? Okay, so basically we've had something cooking up in the cauldron, so to speak, that we're preparing for you for Samhain, which is actually the last of the pagan holidays in the cycle. It's the 8th and final Sabbath for the year before the cycle starts again at the winter solstice, the dark night. So Samhain sort of represents, it's the Sabbath of the dead, and anyway, so this year on Samhain or Halloween will be a full moon. That morning, actually, I will be in Digby, Nova Scotia for attending my first Mi'kmaq Sweat Lodge ceremony, which my good friend Eric is starting to introduce me to that whole tradition. So I really look forward to that. So perhaps we'll have to actually do the recording of the podcast maybe on the 30th. So, and then we were going to broadcast it live on the evening of Samhain, so that all of you people who are maybe bored, cooped up at home on Halloween night, unable to go out and do your regular trick-or-treating that you would normally do during our modern crazy times in this sort of current phase of the Kali Yuga, where we've entered a sort of strange darkness surrounding this global pandemic, and I guess we'll have to see how all of that plays out in the modern day. But if everyone wants something exciting to do while you're stuck at home on Halloween night this year, you can tune in around 9 o'clock Atlantic Standard Time, and we'll be broadcasting the next episode in the Mysteries of Jyotish, which will be the mysteries of the nakshatras, as we've been discussing. So I'm going to put Mr. Neal John on the spot here, and I'm going to say that in the celebration of dressing up for the holiday of Halloween, I will be personally dressing as my favorite childhood supervillain, the Joker. And perhaps Mr. Neal John would like to accept my challenge and show up with a little costume of his own. So we'll just see. But myself, having Saturn in my first house, you know, I've got a little bit of a Joker in me. Mr. Neal John might argue, he says that I could potentially be more of a Riddler. I'll leave it up to our audience here to decide if I have more of a Jupiterian Riddler kind of vibe going, or if I'm more of a Saturnian Joker kind of character. I'll leave that up to all of you. And so, yeah, anyway, we'll meet again on Halloween night. And for now, I'll leave it there. And I guess, Mr. Neal John, if you have anything final to say, go right ahead.
Thank you so much for having me again. I had a lot of fun doing this today, more than I expected, which is an understatement because I actually was looking forward to it. So
yeah, myself as well. It ended up being a great little collaboration here today, I'd say.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to the next episode. And yeah, we'll see you again on Samhain.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one, guys.
Yeah. Take care, everybody. And namaste.